to quiet Chronicles. Settle in and let the day loosen its hold for a little while. Tonight's story begins with a child who was watched almost every hour of her young life. A girl raised inside rules, caution, family ambition, and the silent pressure of a crown that might one day fall upon her head. She was not born to seem powerful. She was small, guarded, stubborn, emotional, and surrounded by adults who hoped to shape her before she could shape herself. Yet that child would live long enough to become the most recognizable monarch on earth, the woman whose name came to describe an age of steam engines, empire, mourning clothes, family portraits, industrial ambition, and a Britain that believed itself to be standing at the center of the world. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long historical journeys, a like and subscription helps Quiet Chronicles continue publishing new stories each week. And if you are listening from somewhere across the world, let us know in the comments where this story is reaching you tonight. You can also tell us which person, era, kingdom, empire, mystery, or forgotten life you would like us to cover next. For now, the story begins not with an empire, not with a jubilee, and not with the old queen in black, but with a young princess inside Kensington Palace, where childhood itself became part of a political struggle. Chapter 1. The Palace Child. Kensington Palace stood within the western reach of London, close enough to the centre of royal power to belong to it, yet separate enough to feel like a world with its own rules. In the early 19th century, it was not the grandest palace in Britain, nor the newest, nor the one most strongly associated with sovereign display. Its red brick ranges and formal gardens carried older layers of royal life, the memory of earlier courts, and the settled habits of a residence where rank was measured not only by rooms and titles, but by who could enter, who had to wait, and who controlled the door. Inside that palace, on the 24th of May 1819, a girl was born who seemed at first to be one more small answer to a very large dynastic problem. Her full name was Alexandrina Victoria. The first name honored her godfather, Tsar Alexander of Russia, while the second came from her mother, Victoria, Duchess of Kent. In the nursery, however, the child would come to be known by the shorter name, Drina, a name that belonged more naturally to the household than to the state. She was the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III, and of Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a German widow who had entered the British royal family through a marriage arranged as much by succession anxiety as by affection. By the time the child was born, the older generation of Hanoverian princes had already made the future of the crown uncertain through late marriages, failed alliances, and the absence of surviving legitimate heirs. That uncertainty had become sharper after the death of Princess Charlotte in 1817. Charlotte had been the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent, later George IV, and her death after childbirth left Britain without the direct line of succession that many had expected. The event caused public mourning, but inside the royal family it also caused calculation. The unmarried royal dukes, already middle-aged, suddenly had a new urgency to produce heirs. Prince Edward, who had spent much of his adult life in military service and debt, married Victoria of Saxe-Coburg, and their daughter became one of the children upon whom the future might rest. A cradle could be a family object, but in a royal house it could also be a constitutional fact. Prince Edward did not live long enough to shape his daughter's life. He died in January 1820, when Victoria was still an infant, after an illness caught during a cold winter at Sidmouth. 6 days later, King George III also died, and the throne passed formally to George IV. The baby at Kensington lost her father before she could remember him, and the royal family around her rearranged itself once again. Her mother was left in Britain with a young daughter, limited money, uncertain standing, and a future that depended on the same child who depended on her. The Duchess of Kent was not a reigning figure, but she possessed the person of a possible queen. From that situation grew the household order that later became known as the Kensington system. Its chief designer was Sir John Conroy, an ambitious Irish-born officer who had served the Duke of Kent and remained close to the Duchess after the Duke's death. Conroy saw clearly that Victoria's possible future could give power to those who controlled her present. If William IV died while Victoria was still underage, the Duchess of Kent might become regent, and Conroy, standing near the Duchess, might become one of the most influential men in Britain. Such hopes gave ordinary nursery rules a political edge. Every habit of the child's day could be made to serve the question of dependence. Victoria's childhood was therefore arranged with unusual vigilance. She was rarely left alone. She slept in her mother's bedroom long after many children of her rank would have been given more privacy. She was not allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. Her companions were selected, her movements watched, her visits controlled, and her understanding of her own position carefully managed. The system did not need chains or open cruelty to do its work. It operated through schedule, proximity, permission, and the constant presence of adults who made freedom feel like something granted from above. Baroness Louise Lezen, Victoria's German governess, stood inside this world but did not belong wholly to Conroy's designs. Lezen had been appointed to guide the young princess, and over time she became one of the most important emotional figures in Victoria's childhood. Her loyalty was not to Conroy, but to the child herself, and this mattered. Around Victoria, the adults were not one united circle. The Duchess of Kent, Conroy, Lezen, visiting relatives, royal uncles, and court officials all carried different hopes for the small princess. A child who seemed sheltered from politics was in fact surrounded by it in household form. The emotional effect of this arrangement was lasting. Victoria grew affectionate, but also defensive. She could be warm, lively, and eager for approval, yet she also developed a stubborn resistance to those she believed were trying to command her. Later observers sometimes treated her willfulness as a natural royal trait, as if it came from the crown itself. In Kensington, however, will was a form of self-protection. The child learned that obedience could become entrapment, that kindness could arrive with calculation behind it, and that affection might be used as a claim upon her future. The lessons were not abstract. They were learned in rooms, corridors, lessons, supervised walks, and the small permissions of each day. One of the revealing facts about her childhood is that she was not fully told at first how near she stood to the throne. The adults around her understood the line of succession, but the child's knowledge came more gradually. According to later recollection, Victoria discovered her place in the succession through a genealogical table slipped into a history book during one of her lessons. The story has the neatness of family memory, but even if softened by recollection, it captures something true about her situation. Her future had been discussed around her before it was fully explained to her. The throne was not introduced as a sudden gift, but as a pressure that had been present before she could name it. When she understood, she is said to have responded with a simple resolution that she would be good. The sentence has often been repeated because it gives her childhood a moral clarity that later events complicated. To be good, for Victoria, did not mean to become passive. It meant to prepare herself for a role she increasingly believed others might misuse if she remained weak. In that sense, the knowledge of succession gave her a private counterweight against the Kensington system. Conroy and the Duchess might manage the household, but they could not entirely control what the child's awareness of her own destiny began to do inside her. The wider royal family added its own tensions. George IV, who reigned until 1830, had little close warmth with the Kensington household. After him came William IV, Victoria's uncle, a blunt and aging king who disliked the influence of the Duchess of Kent and Conroy. William had surviving illegitimate children, but no legitimate heir who could displace Victoria. As his reign advanced, the question became not whether Victoria might inherit, but whether he would live long enough for her to reach 18 and avoid a regency led by her mother. The old king's quarrels with the Duchess were not merely family unpleasantness. They were struggles over who would stand closest to the next reign. At public ceremonies, Victoria sometimes appeared as the young hope of the dynasty, but the public image was cleaner than the private household behind it. She attended events, was presented, observed, and gradually became known to the country that might one day call her queen. Yet her daily life remained narrow. Lessons occupied much of her time, including languages, music, drawing, religion, history, and the social accomplishments expected of a royal girl. Her German connections mattered, her English identity had to be strengthened, and her manners were watched as signs of future suitability. Education in Kensington was never only education. It was preparation for visibility. The Duchess of Kent's position was difficult, and a fair chronicle has to leave room for that difficulty. She was a foreign-born widow raising a child in a royal family that did not fully embrace her. Money was a concern, status was uncertain, and the future of her household depended on guarding her daughter from influences she distrusted. Yet, under Conroy's guidance, protection hardened into control. The Duchess's closeness to Victoria did not produce trust in the way she hoped. It produced resentment, because the young princess came to associate her mother's household with the restrictions that pressed on her most closely. A mother could be near every day and still become, in the child's mind, part of the war. Conroy's own hopes became increasingly plain as Victoria grew older. He wanted formal recognition, influence, and perhaps some signed promise that would secure his place when the crown passed to her. His pressure on Victoria, especially during an illness at Ramsgate in 1835, became one of the defining memories of her youth. While she was unwell, Conroy and the Duchess tried to persuade her to appoint Conroy as her private secretary. Victoria refused. The moment mattered because it showed that the girl raised under dependence had learned how to resist dependency when it threatened her future authority. Weakness of body did not produce surrender of will. Such moments did not make her childhood happy, but they made it formative. Victoria's later insistence on personal authority, her intense attachments, her suspicion of manipulation, and her hunger for honest devotion all had roots in the Kensington years. When she later clung to Lord Melbourne, then to Albert, and later still to the rituals and loyalties that surrounded her widowhood, she was not only behaving as a queen, she was also answering, again and again, the early experience of being managed by people whose love and ambition had become difficult to separate. The palace child carried that memory into every later room of power. As William IV aged, the waiting grew more tense. Victoria approached her 18th birthday in May 1837, and with it the end of any possibility that her mother would serve as regent. William, who had once openly expressed the wish to live until Victoria came of age, survived long enough to see that point reached. The legal danger of a Kensington regency passed. Conroy's greatest hope weakened. The Duchess of Kent remained Victoria's mother, but the political leverage of the household had changed. A young woman who had been watched, handled, and guarded was now legally close to ruling in her own right. During those final weeks before accession, Victoria was still living inside Kensington Palace. The rooms, routines, and familiar tensions had not vanished. Leyson remained close. The Duchess remained nearby. Conroy remained a presence she distrusted. Outside, ministers, courtiers, and politicians understood that a reign might begin at any hour. Inside, the young princess continued in the same residence where so much of her childhood had been arranged by others. The first chapter of her life ended not with escape, but with waiting. When the crown finally came, it would arrive early in the morning, carried by men who crossed London with official news from a dying king's bedside. Victoria had been prepared for power by people she did not fully trust, educated for a throne she had not chosen, and hardened by a childhood that made independence feel necessary before it became ceremonial. Kensington had made her small world narrow, but it had also taught her to recognize control when she saw it. The next movement of her life began when that narrow world opened, and the watched child became the sovereign before breakfast. Chapter 2. A Crown Before Breakfast. June 20, 1837, began before the young princess had taken up the ordinary shape of the day. At Windsor Castle, William IV had died in the early hours of the morning, ending a reign that had been short, uneasy, and important chiefly because it had carried the crown past the danger of a regency. The news moved quickly toward Kensington Palace, not as rumour, but as procedure. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham travelled through the morning to bring the official word to the person who was no longer merely Princess Alexandrina Victoria. Their journey turned a private household into the doorway of a reign. Kensington had known anticipation for weeks, but anticipation is different from arrival. The servants were roused, messages passed through rooms, and the Duchess of Kent's household found itself inside the first minutes of a new political order. Victoria was awakened and came to receive the visitors in a dressing gown, with her hair loose and the simplicity of sleep still close around the scene. This detail has survived because it makes the change feel almost impossible in scale. A young woman who had gone to bed as a princess stood before two senior men of church and court as Queen of the United Kingdom. The words that followed were brief. William IV was dead, and the crown had passed to her. Victoria's first response was not a speech written for history, but a request that those present pray for her. The scene has often been retold because it holds, without needing much ornament, the strangeness of hereditary monarchy. A life can be altered by news delivered at a bedroom door. The law has already acted before the person has fully awakened to it. That morning did something else as well. It separated Victoria from the Kensington system at a single stroke. Sir John Conroy's hopes of commanding the next reign through the Duchess of Kent had already weakened when Victoria reached 18, but accession made his position more fragile still. The Duchess remained her mother, and the habits of the household did not vanish in one breath. Yet the old structure had lost the legal basis on which it had depended. The child who had been watched could now decide who would stand near her. One of the first quiet facts of the reign was that Conroy would not be allowed to govern access to the Queen. Victoria's age mattered to everyone watching. She was 18, old enough to rule without a regency, but young enough to make experience a problem at every turn. No one could pretend she had acquired statecraft through long public apprenticeship. Her education had been serious, and her self-command in certain moments had been notable, but she had not governed a parish, a regiment, a household department, or a party. The crown gave her authority before it gave her knowledge. Around her stood men who had spent decades inside the language of office, and she had to learn that language quickly. Later that same day, Victoria held her first Privy Council at Kensington Palace. The gathering brought into her presence the senior political and ecclesiastical figures of the kingdom, men old enough to have known several reigns and experienced enough to measure the young queen with care. She entered in black, for the court was in mourning for William IV, and she took her place before them with a composure that impressed many of those present. Her declaration was read, and she spoke of the duty that had come to her. The ceremony did not require grandeur to be serious. Its power lay in recognition. The Privy Council mattered because monarchy in Britain did not operate by feeling alone. Accession was hereditary, but rule became visible through instruments, oaths, proclamations, and councils. The young queen's words were copied, witnessed, and carried outward through the state. Officials who had served the old king now served her. Seals, signatures, titles, and forms moved into new alignment. Such materials can seem dry from a distance, but they are the body of constitutional continuity. A kingdom changes sovereign by making sure that ordinary administration does not stop. In the days that followed, proclamations announced Victoria's accession. Her name moved into churches, legal documents, military commissions, and public notices. Coins and official forms would follow in due course, because monarchy reached ordinary people through objects as much as ceremony. A new reign entered the country through paper, metal, prayers, uniforms, and the spoken formula of loyalty. Many subjects would never see Victoria in person, but they would encounter her name as part of daily authority. The girl from Kensington had become a printed presence. For Victoria herself, the first pleasure of queenship was independence. She arranged to have her bed moved from her mother's room, an act small in furniture and large in meaning. After years of enforced closeness, the ability to decide the arrangement of her own sleeping space was not trivial. Household geography had always been political in Kensington, and it remained political now. Distance from the Duchess of Kent did not mean a clean break in feeling, but it created the first visible boundary between mother and sovereign. Lord Melbourne soon became the central political figure of these early days. As Prime Minister, he stood near the throne at the moment when Victoria most needed instruction, reassurance, and companionship. Melbourne was a Whig, experienced, urbane, and old enough to give advice without appearing to compete with her youth. He could explain documents, offices, personalities, and parliamentary custom in a tone that made government feel less forbidding. To Victoria, who had escaped one household influence only to face the much larger machinery of state, Melbourne's guidance seemed almost providential. That dependence carried risks from the beginning. A constitutional monarch needed to work with ministers, but also to survive changes of ministry. Victoria, however, attached herself to Melbourne with the intensity of someone who had long been hungry for trustworthy adult guidance. His conversation pleased her. His manners reassured her. His political world became, for a time, the world through which she understood public life. A queen was expected to stand above party, but her first lessons in sovereignty came from a party minister she adored. The coronation was set for June 28, 1838, a little over a year after accession. During that year, Victoria's public image began to settle. She was young, small in stature, direct in manner, and visibly different from the aging royal uncles who had preceded her. The monarchy had been damaged by the scandals, debts, estrangements, and domestic disorder of the previous generation. Victoria's youth offered a kind of renewal before she had done very much at all. People could place hope upon her because she did not yet carry the stains of long public failure. Westminster Abbey gave that hope ceremonial form. The coronation brought together clergy, peers, officers of state, foreign ambassadors, musicians, attendants, and spectators into one elaborate public act. The service was ancient in its claims, but its performance in 1838 was not always smooth. There were uncertainties of movement, moments of confusion, and the now famous incident in which the elderly Lord Rolles stumbled while coming to pay homage, prompting Victoria to move toward him with concern. Such imperfections made the ceremony more human. A ritual meant to display majesty also revealed the youth and quick sympathy of the person at its center. The crown itself carried weight in more than one sense. Coronation regalia translated an invisible legal fact into visible form. The orb, the scepter, the ring, the anointing, the enthronement, the homage of the peers. Each object belonged to a language older than the young woman who handled it. Yet the ceremony also depended on her body, her voice, her posture, and her endurance through a long and demanding day. Monarchy often survives by making the human person appear continuous with the institution. At Westminster, Victoria had to become both. Public reaction was broadly warm. Crowds filled London, and the coronation helped fasten Victoria to the national imagination as a fresh beginning. She was not yet the widow in black, not yet the imperial grandmother, not yet the ancient sovereign of jubilees and photographs. She was a young queen whose reign seemed to promise moral repair after a troubled royal era. This hope was partly unfair, because no 18-year-old could carry the expectations of a kingdom without strain. It was also politically useful, because monarchy needed affection as much as law. Behind the public image, the practical work of rule continued. Victoria read papers, met ministers, signed documents, asked questions, and learned the rhythm of audiences. She discovered that sovereignty involved repetition as much as ceremony. Dispatches arrived. Appointments required approval. Parliamentary matters had to be followed. Foreign affairs appeared in memoranda whose consequences stretched far beyond the rooms in which she read them. A crown could glitter once at Westminster, but its daily form was ink. The first year of her reign therefore moved between liberation and dependence. She had escaped Conroy's system, gained control over her household, and stood before the kingdom as sovereign. At the same time, she leaned heavily on Melbourne, knew little of political neutrality, and had not yet learned how sharply affection could interfere with judgment. Her youth gave the monarchy freshness, but it also made her vulnerable to the first trusted voice that explained power kindly. The next part of the story belongs to that attachment and to the minister who helped a young queen feel that government itself could be made almost companionable. Chapter 3. Melbourne and the Young Queen. Lord Melbourne entered Victoria's reign with the ease of a man who had already learned the temper of public life and no longer needed to hurry through it. He was Prime Minister when she became Queen, and his place near her in the first months of rule was both constitutional and personal. He explained papers, advised on appointments, interpreted the habits of Parliament, and gave the young sovereign a form of companionship she had not known inside the guarded rooms of Kensington. To a queen who had only just escaped the management of Conroy and the closeness of her mother's household, Melbourne's guidance felt less like control than rescue. William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, was not a stern political tutor. He had charm, melancholy, patience, and a conversational manner that made difficult matters seem less severe. His own life had contained scandal, disappointment, and long experience of human weakness, which perhaps helped him deal gently with Victoria's eagerness. She was young, quick in judgment, affectionate in attachment, and proud of her new independence. Melbourne gave her the feeling that government could be understood through conversation, and that the heavy machinery of state could be made almost domestic if explained by a trusted voice. Their daily rhythm soon became one of the defining facts of the early reign. Melbourne dined with her, spoke with her, read papers with her, and helped turn the unfamiliar language of office into something she could bear. Dispatches, parliamentary reports, names of ministers, court appointments, and political calculations came before her in a steady stream. He did not make her a ruler by handing her power because the crown had already done that. He made the first exercise of power feel less lonely. This closeness was understandable, but it was not simple. Melbourne was a Whig Prime Minister, and Victoria's early court took much of its character from the Whig world around him. The ladies who served near her, the tone of the household, and the social circle in which she felt most comfortable all leaned toward that political connection. A constitutional monarch was expected to stand above party, at least in public posture, but Victoria had inherited the crown before she had learned the emotional discipline such neutrality required. Her first political education came wrapped in personal affection. Melbourne's influence also answered a need left by the Kensington years. Victoria had spent childhood resisting adults who seemed to want her dependence. With Melbourne, dependence appeared under another form. He did not press her as Conroy had pressed her, did not seem to scheme through her mother, and did not treat her youth as a weakness to be exploited. The contrast made him precious to her. What she had rejected in Kensington as domination, she accepted from Melbourne as kindness, and this made the attachment more powerful than ordinary ministerial confidence. Baroness Lazen remained close during this period, and her place in Victoria's life complicated the household further. Lazen had been the loyal governess who helped preserve the princess's sense of self against Conroy's system. Now she stood near the Queen as a familiar figure from childhood, someone whose presence reassured Victoria that the old struggle had not been lost. The Duchess of Kent, by contrast, found herself pushed away. Victoria's first acts of independence had created a physical and emotional distance from her mother, and the early court became a place where former household tensions continued under royal conditions. The public saw a young queen of promise, and for a time that promise softened many doubts. Victoria was diligent, punctual, and serious about the papers placed before her. She enjoyed ceremony and responded warmly to admiration, but she also wanted to be seen as conscientious. Melbourne encouraged this confidence. He praised her judgment, soothed her anxieties, and allowed her to feel that she was learning quickly. A young sovereign, like any young person released from constraint, could mistake relief for mastery. The first serious wound to this confidence came through the affair of Lady Flora Hastings. Flora Hastings was a lady-in-waiting to the Duchess of Kent, and therefore belonged to the part of the household Victoria distrusted. In 1839, Flora's appearance led to rumours that she was pregnant, and the suspicion spread inside the court with a cruelty sharpened by faction. Victoria believed the rumour, or at least allowed herself to be guided by those who did, and Flora was subjected to medical examination. She was not pregnant. She was gravely ill. Cancer, not pregnancy, explained Flora's condition, and her death later that year turned court gossip into public reproach. The Queen's enemies and critics used the affair to present Victoria as heartless, immature, and too ready to believe harm of someone connected to her mother's circle. The details were painful enough without needing embellishment. A woman had been humiliated under suspicion, and the young Queen had been near the center of the judgment that made it possible. Victoria did not yet know how costly household hostility could become when carried by sovereign authority. Melbourne's role in this affair did not destroy Victoria's trust in him, but it showed the limits of a political education built around personal reassurance. He could advise, comfort, and explain, yet he could not give her instantly the deeper habit of impartiality. A monarch needed to suspect her own preferences, especially when they concerned people she disliked. Victoria had learned to resist manipulation. She had not yet learned to distrust resentment. That distinction would matter again almost immediately. The bedchamber crisis of 1839 grew from an apparently narrow question about household appointments. Melbourne's Whig government weakened, and Sir Robert Peel, the Conservative leader, was asked to form a ministry. Peel understood that for his government to function, the Queen's household needed to reflect, or at least not openly contradict, the political change. Several of the ladies closest to Victoria were wives or relatives of Whig politicians. Peel asked for changes among the ladies of the bedchamber, not as a personal insult, but as a sign that the court would not remain visibly attached to his opponents. Victoria refused. To her, the request felt like an invasion of her private life, a demand that she surrender women who had become companions and symbols of her independence. She had only recently escaped Conroy's efforts to command her household. Now another man, newly arrived and personally colder to her than Melbourne, seemed to be telling her whom she might keep near her own person. The constitutional argument was real, but so was the emotional memory through which she received it. Peel's request entered a mind already trained by Kensington to hear household control as danger. The crisis that followed revealed how easily the private rooms of a queen could become the center of national politics. Peel could not form a government under conditions that made the court look hostile to him from the start. Victoria would not give up the Whig ladies whose presence reassured her. Melbourne returned to office, and the young Queen felt she had defended her personal dignity. Many Conservatives saw something else, a sovereign too bound to one party, unwilling to accept the ordinary consequences of ministerial change. For Victoria, the victory was warm and immediate. Melbourne was back, her household remained intact, and the feared displacement had been avoided. Yet the apparent success carried a lesson she did not fully absorb at once. The crown was not meant to be a refuge from political alternation. If governments changed, the monarch had to work with men she did not prefer, and the household could not appear to be a permanent Whig fortress. The Queen had defended her companions, but she had also exposed her inexperience. Melbourne himself understood more of the danger than Victoria did. His affection for her did not erase the fact that he had benefited from her refusal. He continued to guide her, but the arrangement could not last forever. He was aging, his government was vulnerable, and the political world would not remain arranged around the comfort of a young sovereign. Victoria's education had advanced through attachment, but constitutional monarchy required a discipline beyond attachment. The bedchamber crisis made that need visible even while it postponed the moment when she would have to accept it. During these early years, Victoria's character began to appear more clearly to those around her. She could be generous, lively, and devoted. She could also be abrupt, certain, and resistant when she believed her autonomy was threatened. None of these qualities were separate from her childhood. The watched child of Kensington had become a queen who guarded her rooms, her companions, her judgments, and her right to choose. Melbourne helped her feel safe in power, but he also allowed her to remain, for a little longer, emotionally sheltered from the full coldness of political life. That shelter would not be provided by Melbourne alone for much longer. Beyond the Whig drawing rooms and ministerial papers stood another figure whose influence would reach deeper into the daily structure of Victoria's life than any prime minister could. He came from Coburg, from the same family network that had helped shape her mother's marriage and her own future. At first he was a cousin, then a suitor, then the man Victoria herself would choose. Melbourne had taught the young queen how comforting guidance could be, but Prince Albert would ask for something more difficult: partnership, discipline, and a reordering of the monarchy from within. Chapter 4. The Prince from Coburg. Prince Albert came from the small German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a place far from the scale of Britain, but close to the family strategies that shaped 19th-century monarchy. Coburg did not possess the ships, money, parliament, colonies, or public reach of Britain, but it possessed something valuable in the marriage politics of Europe: relatives placed carefully across thrones, courts, and dynastic possibilities. Albert was Victoria's first cousin, the younger son of Duke Ernest I, and his connection to her did not appear by accident. Behind both young people stood King Leopold of Belgium, Victoria's uncle, Albert's uncle, and one of the most patient arrangers of the family's future. Leopold had known the British succession from its wounded centre. Years earlier, he had married Princess Charlotte, the daughter of the Prince Regent, and for a short time he had seemed destined to stand beside a future British queen. Charlotte's death in 1817 ended that hope and altered the royal line that eventually led to Victoria. Leopold's later kingship in Belgium gave him a European throne of his own, but Britain remained part of his imagination and his family policy. When he looked at Victoria and Albert, he saw not only two cousins of suitable age. He saw a chance to bind Britain and Coburg through a marriage that might steady the young queen and elevate the prince. Albert's childhood had not been simple. His parents' marriage was unhappy, and his mother, Louise, was separated from the Coburg court when he was still young. That private loss belonged to the background of his formation, though it should not be made to explain him too neatly. He was educated carefully, trained in languages, music, drawing, riding, and the disciplined habits expected of a German prince. The people around him believed he possessed seriousness, moral purpose, and a capacity for work. These qualities would later matter in Britain more than charm alone, because the husband of a reigning queen would need to justify his place every day. Victoria first met Albert before she was queen during a Coburg family visit to Kensington in 1836. The encounter pleased her, though it did not immediately decide her future. She noticed his appearance, his manners, and his gentleness, and her letters from that time show a young woman capable of admiration even while remaining wary of being directed. Marriage was a subject around which adults had long gathered their plans. Victoria understood enough of household politics to dislike pressure, and any arrangement too visibly urged by others could stir resistance in her. She had escaped Conroy's management too recently to welcome another design placed over her life. Baron Stockmar, another Coburg advisor with a long connection to Leopold, helped shape the expectations surrounding Albert. Stockmar believed in constitutional monarchy, moral seriousness, and the disciplined improvement of royal life. To him, Albert was not merely a husband to be placed beside Victoria, but a possible reforming presence within the British court. This idea was ambitious because Albert had no British office, no native political base, and no automatic authority over ministers. His influence would have to come through character, usefulness, and Victoria's trust. Before he arrived as a bridegroom, he was already being imagined as a corrective. When Victoria became queen in 1837, the marriage question changed in weight. She was no longer a princess whose relatives might negotiate her future in the usual dynastic manner. She was sovereign, and that altered the custom of proposal. No man, not even a prince chosen by family expectation, could formally offer himself to a queen in the ordinary way. If marriage came, Victoria would have to initiate it. The old language of courtship had to bend before the legal and ceremonial reality of female sovereignty. For a time, she did not hurry. Melbourne's presence filled much of her emotional and political world, and the pleasures of independence were still new. Marriage could look like a narrowing of freedom, especially to someone whose childhood had been governed by adults claiming to know what was best for her. She admired Albert, but admiration did not erase hesitation. A queen had to think about affection, dynasty, public opinion, religion, nationality, and power. The question of a husband was never only a question of the heart. Albert's second important visit to Britain came in 1839. By then, Victoria had reigned long enough to feel the strain of being young and sovereign, yet not long enough to be fully secure in political judgment. When Albert arrived with his brother Ernest, she saw him differently. He was handsome, composed, cultivated, and serious in a way that appealed to her imagination. The attraction grew quickly. What family diplomacy had prepared, personal feeling now animated. Victoria's own letters and later recollections make clear that she was not dragged unwillingly into the marriage. Once convinced, she moved with striking certainty. The proposal came from Victoria because it had to. She summoned Albert and offered marriage in the language available to a queen who was also a young woman in love. The moment is easy to sentimentalize, but its deeper interest lies in the reversal of rank. Albert could not command the future. Leopold could encourage, Stockmar could advise, Melbourne could observe, and the Coburg family could hope. Only Victoria could make the decisive gesture. Her proposal joined personal desire to sovereign authority in a single act, and Albert accepted a life in which his public importance would depend on a wife whose rank exceeded his own. This acceptance brought its own difficulty. Albert was not becoming king. In Britain, the husband of a queen regnant did not automatically receive the crown matrimonial, and the country had old anxieties about foreign consorts. Memories of earlier European entanglements, religious suspicion, and parliamentary jealousy all shaped the atmosphere into which he would arrive. A foreign prince at the Queen's side could be admired in private and distrusted in public. He would be near power without possessing a clearly defined constitutional place. Melbourne, who had been Victoria's chief companion in the early reign, watched the engagement with mixed but courteous feeling. He understood that marriage would change the daily pattern of the Queen's life. His own influence, so natural while Victoria was unmarried and inexperienced, would no longer occupy the same emotional space. Yet he also saw the usefulness of a suitable husband. A young queen could not forever rely on a prime minister for the kind of intimate support that ordinary rulers found in family, household, and marriage. Albert's arrival promised stability, though not without displacement. Victoria's happiness was immediate and expressive. She wrote of Albert with warmth, admired his beauty, praised his virtues, and imagined domestic joy with an intensity that belonged partly to her temperament and partly to her release from earlier constraint. The girl who had been denied ordinary freedom now chose, with sovereign power, the person who would stand nearest her. That choice carried a private satisfaction beyond romance. It was a declaration that the future of her household would not be arranged by Conroy, by her mother, or even by the older generation of relatives without her final will. The British public did not receive Albert with unbroken enthusiasm. His German background mattered. The amount of his proposed allowance became a subject of parliamentary debate, and the sum eventually granted was lower than what had been expected. Questions of precedence also revealed unease, because where Albert stood in relation to British peers and royal relatives was not a small matter in a court built on rank. Every chair, procession, address, and signature could signal authority. The man Victoria loved entered a world in which position had to be measured in visible forms. Albert's own temperament made the transition harder before it made it easier. He was conscientious, disciplined, and morally serious, but he was not naturally light in society. He did not arrive with the effortless ease that had made Melbourne so comforting to Victoria. His mind turned toward order, improvement, and responsibility. Those traits would later give him great influence, yet at the beginning they could make him seem foreign not only in nationality but in manner. Britain liked the idea of royal domesticity, but it did not instantly know what to do with a prince who wanted meaningful work. For Victoria, the engagement drew together several strands of her young life. It offered affection after years of guarded childhood. It promised companionship beyond Melbourne's political tutelage. It satisfied dynastic expectation without feeling, to her, like submission to it. Most of all, it allowed her to imagine a royal household governed by mutual devotion rather than surveillance. The hope was sincere, and it would become one of the strongest emotional structures of her reign. Yet marriage would also ask her to share power inside the private world where she had fought hardest to be free. Albert approached Britain with fewer illusions than Victoria. He knew he was entering a difficult position, though perhaps not yet the full loneliness of it. He would have to win the respect of ministers who did not owe him obedience, courtiers who measured him against old rules, and a public ready to suspect foreign influence. He would have to be husband, advisor, father, patron, and working partner without the simple title of king. His route to authority would run through patience, labor, and Victoria's dependence on him. The engagement, therefore, did not end the uncertainty around him. It gave uncertainty a date, a ceremony, and a public form. As the wedding approached, Britain prepared to see its young queen marry a German prince whose virtues were praised by those who knew him, but whose exact place remained unsettled. Victoria saw the matter through happiness and trust. Parliament saw cost and precedent. The court saw rank. Albert saw duty. All of these meanings would enter St. James's Palace with them, where a marriage of affection would become part of the machinery of monarchy. Chapter 5. Marriage inside the monarchy. The wedding of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert took place on the 10th of February 1840 at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. It was a marriage ceremony, but it was also a constitutional arrangement made visible through music, procession, dress, rank, and public attention. Victoria entered not as a princess being handed from one household to another, but as the sovereign herself, the source of the very honors and positions that surrounded the man she was marrying. The chapel held the language of Christian union, yet every movement inside it also belonged to the older language of monarchy. A bride could be happy, nervous, and in love, while the state watched to see what place her husband would occupy. Victoria wore white satin trimmed with Honiton lace, and her choice helped strengthen a fashion that later generations would associate strongly with bridal purity and royal example. Orange blossoms appeared in the arrangement of the dress and hair, a detail that turned private feeling into public image. The material facts mattered because monarchy was read through surfaces. Cloth, jewels, orders, carriages, uniforms, and positions in a procession all told observers how to understand what they were seeing. In Albert's case, even beauty and ceremony could not settle the harder question of power. Albert stood beside a wife whose rank exceeded his beyond comparison. He was a prince by birth, but in Britain he was not king, and no automatic authority came to him through marriage. The country had known queens regnant before, and the memory of foreign husbands had not always been comfortable. Parliament remained alert to the possibility that a foreign prince might gain too much influence near the throne. Many people could admire Albert's manners and still resist the idea that he should become a political presence. The debate over his allowance showed the point plainly. The government had hoped to secure a more generous settlement, but Parliament reduced the amount, and the reduction carried a public message as well as a financial one. Money in royal life was never only money. It measured confidence, suspicion, and the willingness of the political nation to recognize a person's place near the crown. Albert received enough to maintain dignity, but not enough to suggest that the House of Commons intended to indulge him without question. Precedence created another problem. Court life depended on carefully arranged order, and the place of the Queen's husband among royal relatives, peers, ambassadors, and officers of state could not be left vague. A few steps in a procession or a seat at a ceremony might seem small to ordinary observers, but such details formed the visible grammar of rank. Albert had to stand high enough to reflect his closeness to the Queen, yet not so high that older British claims felt displaced by a German newcomer. The court did not think in abstractions when it thought about authority. It thought in doors, chairs, signatures, carriages, and who entered a room first. Within the household, Victoria's feeling for Albert was intense and open. She admired his appearance, his seriousness, his moral discipline, and the dignity he brought into her life after the emotional confusions of Kensington and the political tenderness of Melbourne. To marry him was not, in her mind, a surrender of freedom. It was an act of choice made by a sovereign who had been pressured for years and now believed she had chosen rightly. That confidence gave the early marriage warmth, but it also concealed how difficult the daily adjustment would be. Love could welcome Albert into the Queen's rooms. It could not immediately create his office. Albert's first position in the household was therefore awkward. He had no settled work equal to his abilities, and idleness did not suit him. Victoria enjoyed his company and wanted him near, yet she had been trained by accession to guard her authority. Melbourne still remained politically important, and the old Whig circle had not disappeared. Baroness Lazen, too, continued to occupy a place in the Queen's private life that Albert found increasingly frustrating. The palace after the wedding was not a newly ordered domestic paradise. It was a residence where different loyalties, memories, and habits now had to make room for a husband who intended to be useful. A royal marriage, unlike an ordinary marriage, could not be contained inside affection. Every private adjustment had public consequence. Who advised the Queen, who read her papers, who arranged access, who supervised servants, who managed the nursery after children came, and who shaped the moral tone of the court all mattered beyond the household itself. Albert understood this more quickly than many around him wished. He saw disorder where Victoria saw familiar comfort. He saw dependency where she saw loyalty. His desire to improve the household came from duty, but to those displaced by improvement, duty could feel like conquest. The wedding day itself had offered a gentler image. Crowds gathered outside, Newspapers followed the ceremony closely, and the country received the marriage as a welcome sign of royal domestic stability. After the scandals and unhappy marriages of the previous generation, Victoria and Albert seemed to promise moral repair. Their youth helped the impression. Their affection appeared sincere. A queen who had come to the throne alone now had a husband, and the monarchy could be imagined again through family rather than through the quarrels of aging princes. For Victoria, marriage brought immediate companionship of a kind Melbourne could never provide. Albert shared meals, evenings, letters, music, and the routines of domestic closeness. He was present not merely at audiences or in council, but across the ordinary hours of the day. This mattered to a woman whose early life had made affection both necessary and dangerous. With Albert, she found devotion that seemed morally serious, not manipulative. The relief was powerful. She had wanted to be free, and now freedom seemed to include the right to bind herself completely to someone she trusted. Yet trust changed shape as Albert asked for more than adoration. He wanted access to papers, knowledge of business, and a share in the labor that surrounded the crown. Victoria did not resist him permanently, but the movement was gradual. At first, she could be possessive of her sovereign role, and the habits of dependence on Melbourne did not disappear in 1 month. Albert had entered her heart more easily than he entered the working center of the monarchy. A husband could sit near the Queen before he could stand securely within the state. The birth of their first child, later in 1840, began to alter the household further. The Princess Royal, named Victoria, arrived less than a year after the wedding, and the young Queen discovered the physical demands of motherhood alongside the duties of rule. She did not romanticize pregnancy or infancy in the easy language later associated with Victorian domestic ideology. Childbearing could be exhausting, inconvenient, and emotionally complex for her, even as dynastic necessity made it central to her position. The birth of an heir's generation was a public reassurance made through private pain and nursery routine. Albert's sense of responsibility grew with fatherhood. The nursery, education, household discipline, and the moral formation of the royal children became subjects of serious concern to him. He believed the royal family should model order, duty, and respectability, not merely inherit status. In this belief, he was well matched to the age that would later bear Victoria's name. The monarchy's survival depended less on direct political command than on public trust, and trust could be strengthened through the appearance and practice of disciplined family life. Albert saw the household as the first place where that trust had to be earned. Leizen's influence soon became one of the marriage's central domestic conflicts. To Victoria, Leizen was loyal, familiar, and tied to the years when she had resisted Conroy. To Albert, she represented disorder, indulgence, and an old household structure that prevented the royal family from being properly managed. Their disagreement sharpened after the birth and care of the children, especially when illness or nursery mismanagement raised questions about who truly governed domestic arrangements. Albert's criticism touched not only a servant or governess, but a piece of Victoria's emotional past. Removing Leizen meant rearranging memory. The change did come. Leizen's power faded, and she eventually withdrew from the center of the Queen's life. Albert's authority inside the household increased as a result. He did not achieve this through a single dramatic seizure of power, but through persistence, argument, competence, and Victoria's growing belief that his judgment was steadier than the old arrangements. The marriage had begun with uncertainty about his place. In the daily government of the palace, he began to make that place real. Papers, nurseries, servants, schedules, and private counsel became the materials through which he built influence. Outside the palace, suspicion did not vanish at once. Some critics continued to watch Albert as a foreign presence near the crown. Others mocked his seriousness or doubted his usefulness. British public life could be slow to accept a man who had no easy constitutional category. Yet the very absence of a fixed office pushed Albert toward a different form of authority. He would become valuable by doing work that no one could easily dismiss: advising, organizing, patronizing, reading, correcting, corresponding, and lending the monarchy a disciplined moral tone. Victoria's dependence on him grew because the work of rule itself encouraged it. A sovereign received too much paper, too much advice, too many personalities, and too many claims to remain untouched by the person closest at hand. Albert's intelligence made him useful, his devotion made him trusted, his marriage made him unavoidable. Melbourne had explained government to Victoria as a kind elder statesman. Albert began to inhabit government with her as a partner inside the same rooms. The difference was gradual, but it altered the reign. By the early years of their marriage, the monarchy had begun to take on a new shape. It was still constitutional, still dependent on ministers, still watched by Parliament, and still vulnerable to public judgment. But its domestic image had changed. The Queen and Prince were increasingly presented as a moral family at the center of national life, young parents whose household could stand against the disorder associated with earlier royal generations. The image was partly true and partly constructed, like most durable public images. It rested on affection, labor, discipline, childbirth, argument, and carefully managed display. Marriage had not removed politics from Victoria's life. It had brought politics into the most intimate parts of it. Albert's position would continue to grow through children, correspondence, reform projects, and public work, while Victoria's own authority would increasingly be exercised in conversation with him. What began at St. James's Palace as a wedding of affection became, in practice, a reorganization of the Crown's daily life. The next phase would show how nursery, court, and government could no longer be separated, as the royal family itself became one of the central instruments of Victoria's reign. Chapter 6: Children, Court, and the Work of Rule. 9 children were born to Victoria and Albert between 1840 and 1857, and their arrivals changed the monarchy in ways that reached beyond the nursery. The first was Victoria, the Princess Royal, born in November 1840, before the marriage had completed its first year. Albert Edward, later Edward VII, followed in 1841, and after him came Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. The sequence gave the dynasty what the previous Hanoverian generation had so conspicuously lacked: a secure family line, publicly visible, morally presented, and repeatedly renewed before the country. Each birth belonged to private life, but each also steadied the future of the crown. Victoria did not experience motherhood in the sentimental form later attached to her age. She loved her children, but pregnancy wearied and frustrated her, and infancy did not always draw from her the easy tenderness that public myth might expect. She could be affectionate, proud, impatient, and overwhelmed, sometimes in close succession. This made her less like the marble emblem of Victorian domesticity and more like a woman living under its demands before the emblem had hardened. The queen who ruled a kingdom also had to endure childbirth, recovery, nursing arrangements, medical advice, nursery disputes, and the public knowledge that her body was part of dynastic security. Albert took fatherhood with the seriousness he brought to nearly everything. He believed that the royal children should be formed carefully, not indulged by rank or weakened by luxury. Education mattered to him. Discipline mattered. Moral habits mattered. The nursery, in his mind, was not a soft corner of the palace detached from the nation, but the beginning of a public example. If the monarchy was to regain trust after the scandals of earlier royal generations, then the family at its center had to appear orderly, dutiful, and respectable in its daily life. That ambition gave the royal household a new kind of importance. Servants, governesses, doctors, tutors, nurses, and private secretaries all belonged to the machinery by which domestic life became constitutional display. The children's rooms were not public chambers, yet decisions made there shaped the tone of the reign. Who supervised the infants, what lessons were taught, how illness was handled, how discipline was applied, and how much affection softened authority all became part of Albert's effort to bring order into the palace. A cradle near the Queen could carry more political meaning than a speech in a provincial town. The conflict over Baroness Lehzen belonged to this transformation. Lehzen had served Victoria since childhood and had become one of the few figures the Queen associated with loyalty during the Kensington years. To Victoria, she was more than a governess. She was a witness from the old struggle against Conroy, a protector, and a familiar presence from the time before sovereignty. Albert did not share that emotional inheritance. He saw in Lehzen a household influence that had outlived its usefulness and a style of management that seemed careless beside his own standards. Tension sharpened around the nursery. When the Princess Royal was ill as a child, the handling of her care deepened Albert's dissatisfaction with Lehzen's influence. He believed the disorder of the nursery reflected a larger disorder in the household. Victoria resisted at first because criticism of Lehzen felt like criticism of a loyalty that had helped sustain her. The dispute was not only about a child's room or a governess's competence. It was about who would define the Queen's private world after marriage, the old guardian of her girlhood, or the husband who now claimed a partner's right to arrange the life they shared. Albert prevailed gradually. Lehzen's influence receded, and in 1842 she left the central life of the palace. The change hurt Victoria, but it also marked one of the clearest early victories of Albert's domestic authority. He had not been given the title of king, and his public place remained constitutionally delicate, but inside the household he was becoming indispensable. Once he gained control over the practical order of family life, his authority over other parts of the Queen's world became easier to accept. Domestic management opened the way to political partnership. Buckingham Palace, Windsor, and later Osborne each held different parts of this family monarchy. Buckingham Palace was official, exposed, and often uncomfortable, a working royal residence rather than an ideal home. Windsor carried older royal weight and more space for family organization. Osborne House, purchased on the Isle of Wight in the 1840s, offered something more personal. Albert helped design and shape it, and its terraces, sea views, nurseries, and private rooms gave the royal family a residence that seemed less burdened by the old Georgian past. At Osborne, domestic monarchy could be arranged almost from the ground up. Balmoral brought another kind of retreat. The Scottish Highlands gave Victoria and Albert a setting they came to love, partly because it offered distance from London, and partly because it allowed a simpler image of family life under royal control. The landscape, the estate routines, the servants, the Highland dress, and the household habits that formed there became part of Victoria's emotional world. Yet even retreat did not remove monarchy from public meaning. When sovereigns chose a residence, decorated rooms, walked grounds, received guests, and raised children in a certain style, they were also shaping the image by which the country understood them. The children themselves grew under intense expectation. The Princess Royal, known as Vicky, was intelligent, quick, and especially cherished by Albert, who saw in her a mind capable of serious education. Albert Edward, called Bertie, carried the heavier burden of being heir to the throne, and his parents often worried over his temperament, habits, and studies. Alice developed warmth and seriousness of her own. The younger children filled the household with the ordinary variety of family character, but ordinary variety did not remain ordinary under royal conditions. Each child was loved as a son or daughter and watched as a future instrument of dynasty. Education became one of Albert's great domestic projects. He wanted the children to be prepared not only for rank but for duty, and the curriculum reflected his own belief in discipline, languages, religion, history, science, art, and moral improvement. The program could be demanding, especially for Bertie, whose nature did not fit easily with his father's expectations. Victoria often shared Albert's concerns, though she could also soften toward the children in ways that complicated the household's discipline. Parenting inside a palace rarely allowed feeling to remain free from judgment. A child's weakness might be read as a future public danger. The royal family's image mattered because Britain was changing around it. Industrial towns grew, railways spread, newspapers multiplied, and public opinion became harder to ignore. The monarchy did not govern as earlier monarchs had governed. Its survival depended increasingly on visibility, respectability, and the ability to stand as a symbol of moral order above the rough movement of party politics. Victoria and Albert's children helped create that symbol. Portraits of the family, accounts of birthdays, domestic scenes, and carefully managed impressions presented the palace as a household with discipline at its center. Photography, still young in the middle decades of the century, would gradually strengthen this domestic visibility. Earlier monarchs had been known through painted portraits, engravings, coins, and ceremony. Victoria's family came to be seen in newer ways, not instantly by everyone, and not without careful control, but with a growing sense that the royal household had a recognizable human shape. The Queen was not only a sovereign on a throne, she was a wife, mother, and matriarch in formation. That image gave warmth to monarchy, but it also narrowed the roles expected of the people inside it. For Victoria, the demands of family did not remove the demands of rule. Papers continued to arrive. Ministers still required audiences. Parliamentary crises did not pause because of pregnancy, childbirth, or nursery illness. The Queen could be recovering from birth while the state continued its business with indifferent regularity. The pressure helps explain why Albert's role expanded so naturally. He could read, organize, advise, and absorb some of the burden that Victoria found increasingly difficult to carry alone. Marriage, motherhood, and monarchy became interlocked through paperwork. Albert's influence over official business grew because it was useful before it was formally acknowledged. He read dispatches, helped draft replies, studied policy, and developed relationships with ministers. His access came through Victoria, but his authority came through competence. The same qualities that made him strict in the nursery made him valuable in the study: method, concentration, and an appetite for improvement. The household and the state were not separate realms in his mind. Both needed order, and both could be made better by disciplined attention. This partnership did not mean Victoria disappeared behind Albert. She remained sovereign, with strong preferences, sudden dislikes, quick attachments, and a fierce sense of her own position. Yet she came to rely on Albert so heavily that the daily practice of monarchy changed. He helped shape her opinions, sort her papers, manage her time, and steady her responses. When she trusted him, she could accept guidance from him that she would have rejected from others. The watched child of Kensington had become a queen who guarded her autonomy. But Albert had entered the guarded space. The family therefore became both refuge and instrument. It gave Victoria companionship after a lonely youth, children after dynastic uncertainty, and residences where she could imagine a life less exposed than London allowed. It gave Albert the arena in which he could prove his usefulness and extend his authority. It gave Britain a monarchy that seemed morally repaired through marriage, parenthood, and duty. Beneath that image lay argument, exhaustion, illness, disappointment, and pressure. But public institutions often rest on arrangements more complicated than the symbols they produce. As the 1840s moved into the 1850s, Albert's place beside Victoria widened beyond the nursery and the household. He was no longer merely the foreign husband whose allowance had been debated, nor only the disciplined father arranging lessons and routines. His interests reached into education, design, science, administration, and national improvement. The same mind that wanted order in the royal family wanted order in public life. From the rooms of family monarchy, Albert would step further into the visible work of the age, and his quiet kingdom of influence would begin to extend across institutions far beyond the palace. Chapter 7. Albert's Public Kingdom. Albert's influence widened because it had first become useful. In the early months of marriage, many people had wondered what the Queen's husband was supposed to be. He had no ancient English office that made his role obvious, no right to command ministers, and no crown of his own. His position was delicate enough that even those who admired him could hesitate over its limits. Yet daily work has a way of creating authority where titles have not yet caught up, and Albert's authority grew through the papers, routines, reforms, and responsibilities that gathered around Victoria's reign. At the center of this influence lay the ministerial boxes. They were not dramatic objects. They were containers for dispatches, memoranda, reports, drafts, and letters, the daily paper traffic of a constitutional monarchy. Victoria had received such papers from the beginning of her reign, but marriage altered how they were handled. Albert read them with care, discussed them with her, corrected drafts, clarified arguments, and slowly made himself part of the ordinary movement by which information reached the sovereign. A man without a throne could still become indispensable beside one if he understood the documents that passed over it. This was not a simple transfer of power from Victoria to Albert. She remained queen, and she remained intensely aware of rank. But she trusted Albert in a way she trusted no minister, because his advice seemed to come from devotion rather than party. Melbourne had taught her the language of government through affection and conversation. Albert offered something different: method. He brought order to reading, steadiness to response, and a habit of treating each paper as part of a larger duty. Victoria's own temperament could move quickly toward approval, irritation, loyalty, or dislike. Albert's presence slowed some of those movements and gave them form before they entered official language. His work also depended on patience, because British political life did not accept him instantly. Suspicion of foreign influence remained. Newspapers and politicians could still question whether the German prince had too much access to the Queen. The old constitutional anxiety was not foolish in itself. Britain had long resisted the idea that a monarch might be guided by a private favourite beyond parliamentary responsibility. Albert's difficulty was that he had to be useful enough to justify his nearness, but restrained enough not to seem like a hidden ruler. Much of his public life was spent inside that narrow passage. Peel's return to office in 1841 helped Albert's position in a quieter way than Victoria's earlier attachment to Melbourne had done. Sir Robert Peel was serious, administrative, and less personally comforting to Victoria than Melbourne, but he respected competence. Albert, who admired order and practical reform, found in Peel's government a political atmosphere more suited to his own habits. The change of ministry also forced Victoria to mature. She had to work with Conservatives after the earlier bedchamber crisis had revealed her partisan vulnerability. Albert helped make that adjustment possible, not by erasing her preferences, but by encouraging a more disciplined relation to office. The Queen's marriage had therefore become part of her constitutional education. With Albert beside her, she could accept political change without feeling abandoned by the world she trusted. He was not a minister who would fall with a government. He did not belong to the Whig ladies whose presence had once seemed necessary to her independence. His permanence altered the emotional meaning of ministerial turnover. Governments could change, while the central companionship of the reign remained. That fact helped Victoria learn the steadier habits expected of a sovereign who had to receive one prime minister after another. Albert's reforming interests reached well beyond the reading of state papers. Education drew him strongly. So did science, art, architecture, public health, design, and the improvement of museums and institutions. These interests were not ornaments added to royal life for display. He believed that monarchy should be associated with useful progress and that the royal family could lend dignity to causes that strengthened national life. In a century increasingly proud of industry and knowledge, a prince who supported learning and design could help monarchy seem modern rather than merely inherited. His presidency of the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce gave him one institutional base for that public role. The Society's name itself belonged to an age confident that improvement could be organized. Albert's involvement connected him with men who cared about design education, industrial standards, exhibitions, and the relationship between taste and manufacture. A royal figure could not invent Britain's industrial strength, but he could help give it ceremonial focus. Albert understood that the monarchy's future might depend on appearing useful to a society changing faster than court etiquette. Victoria admired this seriousness, though she did not always share every intellectual interest in the same form. She loved Albert intensely and took pride in his abilities. When others doubted him, she often felt the doubt as an insult to herself. His dignity became part of her own sense of royal dignity. Yet dependence on Albert also had a sharper edge. The more she relied on him, the more the habits of rule became shared habits. He did not need to overstep visibly in order to shape the reign. Influence settled through repetition. Foreign policy revealed the sensitivity of that influence. Lord Palmerston, who served as Foreign Secretary during important parts of Victoria's early reign, often acted with a confidence that alarmed both the Queen and Albert. Palmerston's dispatches, recognition of foreign governments, and independent habits seemed to them too careless of the Crown's right to be consulted. Victoria and Albert wanted foreign affairs to pass through proper channels, with drafts seen and royal approval treated as meaningful. Their conflict with Palmerston was not only personal irritation, it concerned whether the monarch's constitutional role in foreign policy would be respected in practice. Albert worked carefully on such matters. He studied dispatches, helped Victoria frame objections, and pressed for more orderly procedure. His influence did not make the Crown dominant over elected government, but it did strengthen the expectation that ministers should not treat royal approval as a mere form. In this sense, Albert was conservative in method even when he supported reforming causes elsewhere. He believed in defined responsibilities, proper consultation, and the moral seriousness of office. Disorder offended him because it seemed to weaken the state. Not all of his public interventions were political in a narrow sense. He took interest in model housing, sanitary reform, agricultural improvement, and the conditions of working people, though always from the viewpoint of a prince who believed improvement should be orderly and guided from above. He was not a radical. He did not seek to overturn hierarchy. His imagination was paternal, disciplined, and reformist within limits. He wanted the upper ranks to justify themselves through duty. This was a familiar Victorian ideal before it became a cliché. Privilege could endure more easily if it appeared industrious and morally accountable. Public speaking became one route through which Albert made that ideal visible. He was not naturally theatrical, and his German accent could attract notice, but his speeches were serious and carefully prepared. He addressed education, industry, social improvement, and the responsibilities of wealth. Each speech helped build a public identity separate from the early suspicion surrounding him. The foreign husband became a working prince. His authority, though never uncomplicated, acquired substance in the eyes of people who valued effort and improvement. Inside the palace, his discipline could feel demanding. Victoria adored him, but adoration did not make marriage without friction. Albert's standards were high, and he could be severe when he believed she was unreasonable, impulsive, or too governed by emotion. She, in turn, could resent correction even from the person she trusted most. Their marriage was loving, but it was not soft in the sense of being without struggle. It joined intense feeling to constant work, and the Crown made every disagreement larger than an ordinary domestic quarrel. The children watched this ordered world forming around them. Their father's seriousness shaped lessons, expectations, and the moral atmosphere of family life. Their mother's devotion to him made his place still stronger. A royal household that had once been marked by Victoria's dependence on Leysen and Melbourne now turned increasingly around Albert's judgment. Even when Victoria resisted him in moments, the wider movement was clear. Albert had become the axis of domestic management, political paperwork, and public improvement. His influence also altered how the monarchy appeared to the country. Earlier Hanoverian kings had often seemed distant, quarrelsome, extravagant, or morally compromised. Victoria and Albert presented something different: marriage, children, work, improvement, and visible seriousness. The image did not erase social conflict in Britain, nor did it solve the hardships of industrial life, empire, poverty, or Irish distress. But it gave monarchy a new moral costume, one better suited to a middle-class public increasingly attentive to respectability. The palace could now be imagined as a disciplined home rather than only as a court. There was a cost in this arrangement, though it was not yet fully visible. Victoria's dependence on Albert became so complete that the machinery of her life increasingly required his presence. He was husband, advisor, organizer, critic, companion, and interpreter of the world beyond her immediate feeling. Such concentration of trust gave the reign coherence while he lived. It also made his absence, when it came, almost impossible for her to absorb. The public kingdom Albert built around himself was made of paper, council, family order, reforming effort, and moral example. Its foundations were strong because they were daily, but they were also personal. For the moment, however, Albert's place continued to grow. He had moved from uncertain foreign bridegroom to indispensable partner, from debated recipient of an allowance to one of the most active figures in the royal household. His influence had not arrived through a single decree. It had gathered through work repeated until others depended on it. The next great public expression of that work would rise not from a throne room or a nursery, but from an enormous structure of glass and iron in Hyde Park, where Albert's belief in industry, order, and national improvement would be placed before the eyes of the world. Chapter 8: The Exhibition Under Glass. Glass and iron gave the Great Exhibition its most memorable body before many visitors had understood what the exhibition was meant to say. The building rose in Hyde Park as a long, transparent hall, designed by Joseph Paxton, with the habits of greenhouse construction enlarged into something almost civic. It did not look like an older palace, heavy with stone and inherited ornament. It looked temporary, bright, engineered, and new. In that difference lay much of its force, because the exhibition was meant to gather the products of industry inside a structure that seemed itself to belong to the age it celebrated. Albert stood near the center of the project from its beginning. His public life had already moved toward education, design, manufactures, and the orderly improvement of national taste, and the exhibition gave those interests a form large enough for the public to recognize. Henry Cole and the Society of Arts helped shape the practical work, while Albert lent the enterprise royal seriousness and political protection. The plan was ambitious and vulnerable. Critics feared expense, disorder, foreign competition, damage to Hyde Park, and the gathering of large crowds in London. A project designed to display confidence first had to survive anxiety. The idea was to bring together the industry of many nations, with Britain placed at the center of organization and display. Machinery, textiles, raw materials, furniture, scientific instruments, ceramics, metalwork, colonial goods, and objects of design would stand under one roof. Such a gathering could appear generous, almost universal, but it also allowed Britain to measure itself against others while presenting itself as host, judge, and model. The exhibition belonged to the language of peace and improvement. It also belonged to the language of competition. Paxton's design helped rescue the project from practical difficulty. The structure used prefabricated elements, repeated units, and large sheets of glass, so that it could be built with unusual speed and later removed. Its great transept enclosed existing elm trees rather than cutting them down, a decision that made the building seem less like an intruder upon the park. The material detail mattered because it turned engineering into persuasion. People suspicious of the exhibition could look at the building and see not only a hall, but a demonstration of efficiency, economy, and adaptability. For Albert, the exhibition offered something that ordinary court ceremony could not. A royal procession displayed hierarchy, but the exhibition displayed work. It allowed monarchy to stand beside machines, manufacturers, artisans, inventors, merchants, and imperial materials without appearing diminished by them. This was a delicate achievement. An older idea of kingship might have treated industry as beneath royal dignity. Albert's understanding of monarchy moved differently. If the age admired improvement, then the crown could survive by honoring improvement in public. Victoria shared Albert's excitement, and her support mattered. She trusted him, admired the breadth of his mind, and took pride in seeing his labor recognized. The exhibition was not hers in the same personal sense as it was his, but her presence gave it legitimacy. As queen, she could make the opening a national ceremony rather than a commercial display. Albert could organize and inspire, but Victoria's appearance attached the project to the crown. Their partnership, so carefully built through household, papers, and public works, now stood before a much larger audience. May 1, 1851, gave the exhibition its ceremonial beginning. Victoria travelled to Hyde Park with Albert and their children, and the opening drew together ministers, ambassadors, commissioners, foreign representatives, court officials, and a crowd whose size helped define the event. The Queen later recorded the day with intense satisfaction, seeing it as one of the happiest and proudest moments of her life. That happiness was not difficult to understand. The man she loved had worked for a public achievement, and the country that once doubted him now watched the result under sunlight passing through glass. The ceremony placed Albert in an unusual position. He was not sovereign, and the formal centrality belonged to Victoria, yet the moral ownership of the exhibition was widely understood to be his. He read the report of the commissioners to the Queen, and she replied from her place as monarch. In that exchange, husband and wife, prince and sovereign, organizer and national symbol met inside one public act. The form preserved constitutional order while allowing Albert's work to receive visible honor. It was a carefully balanced moment, and much of its success came from that balance. Inside the Crystal Palace, visitors encountered abundance arranged into order. The building did not merely hold objects. It classified them, directed attention across them, and invited comparison. British machinery could be seen beside foreign manufactures. Colonial materials could be placed in relation to metropolitan industry. Fine design could be judged against mass production. The exhibition's halls made the world seem legible through display cases, aisles, labels, and categories. A visitor might be overwhelmed by quantity, but the organizers wanted quantity to look disciplined. The Koh-i-Noor diamond became one of the famous exhibits, though its display did not impress everyone at first. Its presence carried imperial meaning that went beyond mineral brilliance. Taken into British possession after the annexation of Punjab, it stood in London as an object through which conquest, diplomacy, wealth, and royal display converged. Many visitors treated it as a marvel. A quieter reading sees it as a sign of how imperial power could place distant histories behind glass and invite the public to look at them as possessions. The exhibition's confidence rested on such arrangements as much as on engines and looms. Machinery drew large attention. Working machines allowed visitors to see movement, production, and mechanical force turned into public spectacle. Steam power, textile equipment, printing, tools, and industrial processes entered a space where families, Aristocrats, foreign visitors, and working people might watch the same demonstration. The noise and movement of machines had long belonged to factories and workshops. In Hyde Park, they became part of a national lesson. Industry could be presented not as grime and strain, but as ingenuity under royal shelter. The crowds mattered almost as much as the exhibits. Millions came during the months of the exhibition, helped by railway travel and by ticketing arrangements that opened the building to different social ranks. The presence of so many visitors without the disorder some had feared became one of the event's own arguments. It suggested that mass public culture could be managed, that ordinary people could move through a great display with discipline, and that improvement could be made into recreation. The building trained its visitors in looking, walking, comparing, and admiring. Albert's reputation rose sharply. The foreign prince who had once seemed difficult to place now appeared as the mind behind a peaceful triumph. He had linked the monarchy to industry without making it vulgar, to international exchange without making it weak, and to public education without making it pedantic. The exhibition did not remove all criticism of him, but it gave his supporters a powerful answer. They could point to Hyde Park and say that his seriousness had produced something visible, orderly, and admired. Profits from the exhibition helped fund what became a lasting cultural district in South Kensington. Museums, colleges, and institutions later associated with science, art, and design drew part of their history from the exhibition's success. This mattered because the event did not disappear when the glass building closed. Its proceeds and its ideas continued in brick collections, classrooms, and public memory. Albert's interest in improvement gained a more permanent geography. The temporary hall in Hyde Park helped seed institutions meant to outlast it. Victoria's own monarchy gained from the exhibition in a related way. She and Albert appeared not merely as figures of rank, but as patrons of national purpose. Their marriage, once questioned because of Albert's foreignness and uncertain place, now seemed productive in public terms. The domestic image of the royal family widened into an image of cultural leadership. A queen, a prince, and their children could stand at the center of a modernizing nation without seeming to resist modernity. The scene suited the early 1850s because Britain wanted to believe that industry, morality, and empire could be made harmonious. Yet the exhibition also contained tensions that its ceremony softened. Industrial progress did not erase poverty. National confidence did not erase class conflict. International display did not erase rivalry. Imperial objects did not arrive in London without histories of force behind them. The Crystal Palace made order visible, but it did not prove that the world it represented was justly ordered. A calm chronicle has to leave that truth in place without turning the chapter away from what the exhibition meant to its own age. The event was both achievement and self-portrait, and self-portraits often show what a society wants to see most clearly. After the exhibition closed, the building itself was removed from Hyde Park and later rebuilt at Sydenham, where it took on another life. The objects dispersed, the visitors returned to their towns and countries, and the royal family resumed the work of rule, correspondence, children, travel, and ceremony. But Albert's public standing had changed. He had shown that his role could not be measured only by title. He could create forms through which monarchy touched industry, education, and national imagination. For Victoria, this success deepened an attachment already central to her life. Albert was no longer only the beloved husband who ordered the household and read papers beside her. He was a public figure whose judgment had been vindicated before Britain and the wider world. His triumph strengthened her pride and increased her dependence. The reign seemed, for a time, to have found a balance between family monarchy and public usefulness. Beyond the glass, however, the decade would not remain so polished. War, reform, imperial crisis, and ministerial strain were already moving toward the palace, and the confidence of 1851 would soon be tested by events no exhibition could arrange. Chapter 9. War, Reform, and Restless Cabinets. Government returned to its less polished forms after the glass halls of 1851. The Great Exhibition had made Britain appear orderly, inventive, confident, and peacefully gathered around industry. But the years that followed placed harsher demands on the monarchy and on the ministers who served beneath it. Foreign affairs moved with an unease that no ceremonial display could soften. Cabinets shifted, newspapers argued, military systems were tested, and the empire beyond Britain's shores pressed itself into the Queen's papers with growing force. Victoria and Albert remained at the center of royal domestic life, but the world entering their rooms was becoming larger and more difficult to arrange. Lord Palmerston gave much of that difficulty a personal form. He was experienced, energetic, and popular in the country, yet to Victoria and Albert he often seemed dangerously independent. As Foreign Secretary, he had a habit of acting with a confidence that made royal consultation feel like an afterthought. Dispatches could be sent, positions taken, and recognitions implied before the Queen and Prince believed proper approval had been secured. Their objection was not merely wounded dignity. In the constitutional monarchy, they understood, ministers governed through Parliament, but the Crown still had a right to be informed, consulted, and treated as part of the state's formal judgment. This struggle over procedure revealed a deeper question about the monarchy's place. Victoria did not command foreign policy as an 18th century monarch might have wished to command it. Yet she was not content to become a decorative seal placed on decisions already made. Albert, with his disciplined sense of order, shared and sharpened that concern. He helped her read drafts, frame objections, and insist that ministerial independence should not become ministerial carelessness. In his mind, the proper movement of papers was not a technical fuss. It was the visible sign that offices knew their limits. The Crimean War drew these concerns into a wider public crisis. Britain entered the war against Russia in 1854, allied with France and the Ottoman Empire, with the conflict centered around the Eastern Question and the balance of power near the Black Sea. At first, war carried familiar language: honor, alliance, resistance to Russian expansion, and the defense of European order. Soon, however, reports from the front exposed administrative weakness, supply failures, medical insufficiency, and the misery of soldiers caught in conditions for which the system had not properly prepared. The age that had displayed machines so confidently in Hyde Park now found its army struggling with boots, transport, hospitals, and winter. Victoria followed the war with close attention. She read reports, wrote letters, received news of battles and losses, and took a personal interest in the soldiers who served under her name. Her position was delicate because she did not direct strategy, and she could not repair military administration by feeling strongly about it. Still, monarchy had emotional duties that government alone could not perform. The Queen could recognize service, express concern, visit wounded men, and help turn military suffering into a matter of national attention. Her sympathy did not solve the war, but it gave the Crown a visible role within it. The creation of the Victoria Cross in 1856 belonged to this connection between military service and royal recognition. The medal was intended to honor acts of valor regardless of rank, a notable principle in an army still marked by hierarchy. Its bronze material, later associated with guns captured from the Russians, gave the decoration a plainness that suited its purpose. To receive such a medal from the sovereign was to have individual courage drawn into national memory. For Victoria, who cared deeply about soldiers and uniforms, medals and reviews offered a way to meet war at the level of named persons rather than only dispatches. Florence Nightingale became another figure through whom the war entered public feeling. Her work in military nursing at Scutari and the wider reforms associated with her name exposed the failures of older systems while also giving the public a language of discipline, care, and reform. Victoria admired her and later communicated with her, seeing in her work both compassion and administrative seriousness. Nightingale's fame did not belong to monarchy, but the Queen's recognition of her helped connect royal attention to the reforming energies released by the war. A hospital ledger could carry as much accusation as a parliamentary speech. The war damaged ministries. Lord Aberdeen's coalition government fell in 1855 under criticism of military mismanagement, and Palmerston became Prime Minister. To Victoria and Albert, this outcome was not wholly comforting, because Palmerston's earlier independence had troubled them for years. Yet public confidence and parliamentary reality mattered. A sovereign might dislike a minister's habits and still have to accept his strength. The Crimean crisis therefore continued Victoria's constitutional education. Personal distrust could not be allowed to overturn the political fact that Palmerston commanded support where others had failed. France also stood close to the war's meaning. Britain's alliance with Napoleon III required careful handling, especially because the Bonaparte name carried older memories of invasion, revolution, and European disruption. Victoria and Albert met the French Emperor and Empress, and state visits helped turn former enmity into ceremonial partnership. The sight of British royalty receiving a Bonaparte ruler would have seemed strange to an earlier generation. Yet 19th century diplomacy often required old symbols to be rearranged around new necessities. Courtesy became an instrument of statecraft. Albert's position during the war was not always easy. His German birth and family connections exposed him to suspicion whenever foreign affairs became heated. Some critics could imagine him as insufficiently British, especially when policy toward continental powers stirred anxiety. Victoria resented such suspicion strongly because she saw Albert as devoted to Britain and to her service. The charge of foreignness had followed him since marriage, but war gave it sharper edges. A prince who worked tirelessly in the Queen's service could still be made vulnerable by the place of his birth. At the same time, Albert's labor continued. He examined papers, advised Victoria, studied military and diplomatic questions, and tried to bring method into the unsettled flow of decisions. His mind was not drawn to war as glory. It was drawn to order, consequence, and the prevention of reckless movement. This made him valuable to Victoria, but it also deepened the habit by which she leaned on his judgment. Each crisis confirmed the arrangement already formed inside the marriage. When the world became more difficult, Albert became more necessary. Beyond Crimea, the empire produced a still greater disturbance in 1857. The uprising in India began among soldiers of the East India Company's Bengal Army and widened into a major rebellion against company rule in northern and central India. In Britain, the events were reported with alarm, anger, grief, and often with racial hostility. The violence was real, and the reprisals that followed were also severe. A gentle chronicle must name the scale and consequence without dwelling on cruelty. The rebellion changed British government because it exposed the instability of a vast imperial system ruled through a chartered company. Victoria received news from India through the channels available to the Crown, and she responded with concern that was at once emotional and political. She was disturbed by reports of violence against British civilians, but she also resisted language of indiscriminate vengeance against Indians as a people. Her later proclamation to India in 1858, issued after the transfer of rule from the East India Company to the Crown, carried a tone of religious non-interference and legal assurance that she valued. The words did not erase the realities of imperial domination, but they mattered as the official language through which the monarchy presented its new relationship to India. The Government of India Act of 1858 ended company rule and brought India under direct Crown authority. This did not mean Victoria personally governed India in any simple sense. Administration passed through ministers, the Secretary of State for India, the India Council, governors, viceroys, soldiers, civil servants, and local structures of power. Yet symbolically, the change was enormous. India was no longer ruled at one remove by a company bearing royal charter. It was attached more visibly to the sovereign's name. The empire had moved closer to Victoria, even though she would never see India herself. For Albert, Indian affairs were another field in which order, justice, and imperial responsibility had to be stated carefully, even when practice fell short. He supported a measured tone in the Queen's proclamation and shared her concern that British vengeance should not define the new regime. The moral language of empire could be sincere in the minds of those who used it and still coexist with coercive rule. This is one of the central difficulties of Victoria's imperial story. The Queen could think of herself as protective and just, while the system attached to her crown rested on conquest, hierarchy, and unequal power. Domestic reform also pressed forward during these years. The expansion of industry, the growth of cities, the visibility of poverty, and the memory of Chartism kept political society alert to the possibility of unrest. Parliamentary reform did not move in a straight line, but pressure accumulated. The monarchy had to watch these changes without appearing either indifferent to suffering or frightened by popular claims. Victoria's instincts were often conservative, especially where social order and property were concerned, yet the reign over which she presided could not avoid adjustment. Britain was learning how to widen political life without surrendering its governing class. Cabinets remained restless because the issues before them were restless. Aberdeen, Palmerston, Derby, Russell, and others moved through office in combinations that reflected party transition as well as personal rivalry. The older political world of Whig and Tory was changing into a more recognizable liberal and conservative structure, though not cleanly or all at once. Victoria had preferences among men, and Albert had judgments about competence. But the Crown increasingly operated within a parliamentary system that required patience with instability. Ministers arrived with promises of order and often left behind papers for someone else to finish. Through all this, Victoria's working life remained intensely documentary. She saw the empire and Europe through dispatches, maps, memoranda, letters, audiences, and printed reports. A rebellion in India, a battlefield in Crimea, a cabinet dispute in London, and a diplomatic tension in Paris might all reach her through paper before they reached her through any public ceremony. The physical distance between palace and event was enormous, but government reduced distance into documents. Albert's place beside her became even more important because the documents did not interpret themselves. The royal couple's public image still carried domestic stateliness, but the substance behind that image had grown heavier. They were not only parents and patrons of improvement, they were participants in a constitutional system managing war, empire, reform, and ministerial conflict. Victoria's emotional nature remained strong, and she could still judge people sharply. Albert's discipline helped give those judgments more structure, even when it did not make them neutral. Together they formed a monarchy that still mattered, not by ruling alone, but by reading, warning, encouraging, resisting, and embodying continuity when governments shifted. By the late 1850s, Albert's labour had become almost inseparable from Victoria's reign. His advice shaped her understanding of ministers. His handwriting and thought lay behind many royal communications. His concerns about order, morality, and public duty entered both the household and the state. The success of this partnership made the monarchy stronger, but it also made it more fragile in one hidden respect. So much now depended on Albert's presence that few around Victoria could fully imagine the machinery of her life without him. The next years would bring that dependence toward its hardest test, first through family strain and then through the loss that changed the emotional temperature of the reign. Chapter 10. The Widow at Windsor. Not every turning point in a reign arrives through an act of parliament, a change of ministry, or a war reported from abroad. Some begin inside a household, with illness in familiar rooms and messages passing between people who have not yet understood that the old pattern of life is ending. For Victoria, the year 1861 gathered several losses and anxieties into one narrow passage. The Queen, who had leaned on Albert through marriage, motherhood, public ceremony and political work, was about to face the removal of the person around whom her daily world had been arranged. The first loss came through her mother. The Duchess of Kent died in March 1861, after years in which her relationship with Victoria had remained marked by the injuries of Kensington. Mother and daughter had not been strangers, but neither had they returned easily to the intimacy that the Duchess may once have imagined. Too much of Victoria's childhood had been shaped by the presence of Conroy, the restrictions of the Kensington system, and the feeling that maternal closeness had been used as a means of control. When the Duchess died, grief came mixed with regret. Victoria discovered letters and traces of affection that made the old distance more painful than she had expected. That bereavement unsettled her deeply. It reopened the early life she had tried in many ways to overcome. Albert supported her through the loss, as he had supported her through nearly every strain of the marriage. He helped order papers, soften distress, and interpret the emotional confusion that followed. His presence made grief bearable because he had become the person through whom Victoria understood bearability itself. She could mourn her mother while leaning on the husband who had replaced the old household with a new center of trust. Albert, however, was already under strain. His public work, private responsibilities, and constant attention to the Queen's papers had worn heavily on him. He was still only in his early 40s, but those around him noticed fatigue, seriousness deepening into heaviness, and a body less able to carry the burdens his mind continued to accept. The Prince Consort had never treated his position as decorative. He read, advised, organized, corrected, corresponded, supervised, and worried. Such labor had given him authority, but it had also made rest difficult. Family anxiety added to the pressure. The Prince of Wales, Albert Edward, had grown into young adulthood under the severe expectations of parents who feared weakness in the heir. Bertie's education had long troubled Albert, who doubted his discipline and worried about his moral steadiness. In 1861, reports of the prince's involvement with an actress while stationed with the army in Ireland reached his parents and caused distress. Albert went to Cambridge to speak with his son in person. The episode did not kill him, as later family memory sometimes seemed to imply, but it formed part of the emotional weather of his final months. Illness came at Windsor before the household had accepted its seriousness. Albert developed fever, exhaustion, and symptoms that physicians of the time identified as typhoid fever, though later interpretations have questioned whether the diagnosis fully explains his decline. The exact medical label matters less to the shape of Victoria's experience than the pace of the loss. The man who had seemed indispensable to the working life of the monarchy became confined to rooms where papers, audiences, and plans could no longer be managed in the old way. The ordinary machinery of the reign waited outside a sick room door. Victoria's fear grew as Albert weakened. She had relied on him not as one advisor among many, but as the living structure of her adult life. He had entered her childhood's guarded space and remade it into marriage. He had organized the household, guided the children, shared the boxes, helped manage ministers, shaped public projects, and given her emotions a place to rest before they became decisions. The thought of his absence was not simply the thought of widowhood. It was the collapse of the daily arrangement through which she had learned to reign. Albert died at Windsor Castle on the 14th of December, 1861. The household loss was immediate, but its meaning spread far beyond the family. The Prince Consort had no crown of his own, yet his work had become so closely joined to Victoria's sovereignty that his death altered the practical rhythm of government. Papers still had to be read, ministers still required answers, children still needed guidance, public ceremonies still belonged to the monarchy. Nothing in the Constitution paused because the Queen's husband was gone. The machinery continued, but the person who had helped her bear its movement was absent. Victoria's mourning began with a force that would define the rest of her life. Black dress became her daily public sign, and the rooms associated with Albert were preserved with ritual care. His clothes, objects, papers, and domestic arrangements were treated not as remnants to be cleared away, but as parts of a continuing presence. Servants maintained certain habits around his rooms. The memory of the prince consort became an order of household life. Grief was not only felt, it was administered. This administration of grief had deep personal meaning for Victoria. She believed Albert had been morally superior, intellectually necessary, and insufficiently valued by the country he had served. In mourning him, she also defended him. The public had not always understood his labor, and after his death she became determined that his greatness should be recognized. Letters, memoirs, memorials, statues, and institutional tributes would carry that determination outward. She did not want Albert to become merely the dead husband of a queen. She wanted him remembered as the mind that had helped dignify the monarchy and improve the nation. Yet the country did not grieve in the same way forever. At first, sympathy for Victoria was widespread. The spectacle of a widowed queen, bereaved after a marriage publicly associated with domestic virtue, moved many people. But sympathy has its own limits in public life. Months became years, and the Queen's withdrawal from ceremony, drawing rooms, openings of Parliament, and social visibility began to trouble politicians and subjects who believed monarchy required presence. Victoria remained sovereign, but she often refused the forms by which sovereignty was expected to appear. Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral became the chief geography of her mourning. These residences had once been parts of family life with Albert. After his death, they became places of retreat, memory, and controlled routine. Balmoral especially held emotional force because Scotland had offered the royal couple a form of privacy and simplicity that Victoria cherished. The Highland world around the estate, with its servants, ponies, gillies, hills, weather, and household customs, became one of the settings in which she could continue a life organized around remembrance. Retreat did not mean idleness. It meant governing through distance, papers, and carefully limited contact. John Brown entered wider attention through that Scottish world. He had served at Balmoral and became one of Victoria's trusted attendants in the years after Albert's death. His plain manner, physical strength, and familiarity with Highland routines seemed to have reassured her. He offered service without the elaborate courtesies of court, and Victoria valued that directness. The relationship later attracted gossip, resentment, and political discomfort, partly because Brown's closeness crossed expectations of rank. For Victoria, he belonged to the practical world that helped her move through days made heavy by memory. The Prince of Wales occupied a more difficult place in this period. Victoria associated Bertie, unfairly but persistently, with the distress of Albert's final months. She did not cease to love him, yet her judgment of him was often severe. His position as heir did not bring him close to real power, and his mother's long life left him waiting for decades. In the early years of widowhood, this distance between sovereign mother and adult son mattered because the monarchy needed public energy that Victoria was unwilling to supply and Edward was not fully authorized to provide. The crown had an heir but not an easy substitute. Government adapted around the Queen's absence. Ministers traveled to her. Papers moved to and from her residences. Audiences occurred, though not always in the public settings that made monarchy visible to the country. Victoria continued to read, comment, object, and advise. She was not politically dead, and it would be wrong to imagine her as having abandoned the work of rule. But her form of rule became more private, more written, and more withdrawn. The public face of monarchy narrowed just when a growing press and expanding electorate made visibility more important. Criticism slowly increased. Republican feeling in Britain never became strong enough to overthrow monarchy, but in the 1860s and early 1870s, it found more confidence than it had possessed during the early domestic glow of Victoria and Albert's marriage. Some critics asked what purpose the monarchy served if the monarch would not appear. Others resented the cost of royal life when the Queen seemed absent from public duty. The emotional claim of widowhood, so powerful at first, could not indefinitely answer every constitutional expectation. A sovereign might suffer privately, but the office remained public. This is one of the sternest facts of Victoria's life. Her grief was genuine, intense, and enduring, but it belonged to a position that prevented it from remaining only hers. The more she withdrew, the more people interpreted the withdrawal through politics. The more she preserved Albert's memory, the more ministers had to manage the practical consequences of a queen reluctant to perform visible monarchy. What would have been a private sorrow in another household became a national condition because the mourner was the state's symbolic center. At the same time, her seclusion helped create the later myth of Victoria as the widow in black. The image became so strong that it can obscure the earlier woman, the eager young queen of Melbourne's time, the passionate bride, the mother of 9 children, the partner of Albert's projects, the sovereign who had watched war and empire enter her papers. Widowhood did not erase those earlier selves, it covered them with a long garment of ritual memory. Beneath it, Victoria remained willful, political, affectionate, resentful, dutiful, and capable of sudden warmth. Albert's death also altered how his life was remembered. During his lifetime, he had been criticized as foreign, earnest, intrusive, or too influential. After death, Victoria's devotion helped raise him into an almost ideal figure of duty and wisdom. The prince consort became safer to praise when he no longer stood near the boxes of power. Memorial culture grew around him because Victoria willed it, but also because the age was ready to honor a model of moral labor. Statues, institutions, biographies, and ceremonies gave his memory the permanence that his constitutional position had never fully possessed while he lived. The monarchy during these years therefore existed in a suspended state. Its legal continuity was never in doubt. Its daily business continued. Its family line was secure, yet its public vitality had weakened, and the Queen's relationship with the nation had become strained by absence. Victoria did not cease to be loved, but she was no longer simply the young promise of 1837 or the happy partner of 1851. She had become a remote sovereign whose grief governed the rhythm of court life, and whose refusal to appear made people ask what monarchy owed to those who sustained it. Out of that strain, a different form of royal visibility would gradually emerge. Victoria would not return to the easy openness of her early reign, and Albert's absence would remain the central fact of her inner life. But ceremonies, memorials, ministerial relationships, family events, and imperial titles would slowly draw her back into public view. The crown did not recover by forgetting Albert. It recovered by turning memory into ritual, and by allowing the widow at Windsor to reappear before the country in forms that made sorrow itself part of monarchy. Chapter 11. A crown reappearing. Albert's death did not end the monarchy's work, but it changed the manner in which that work reached the country. For years after 1861, Victoria remained sovereign through papers, audiences, memoranda, letters, and decisions made from the residences where she chose to live. She was not idle, and ministers who dealt with her knew that her opinions could still be strong, detailed, and difficult to move. Yet monarchy did not exist only in writing. It also required sight, ceremony, procession, and the repeated reassurance of public presence. In the years of widowhood, Britain slowly discovered the difference between a ruling queen and a visible queen. At first, the country had granted her grief a large measure of sympathy. Albert had been associated with domestic virtue, serious labor, family life, and the moral repair of the monarchy after the scandals of the older Hanoverian generation. A widow who withdrew from public festivity after losing such a husband seemed for a time to be acting within the deepest language of Victorian feeling. Mourning had social rules, and the Queen obeyed them with an intensity that exceeded expectation. Black dress, subdued ceremony, and household remembrance gave private loss a public grammar. The difficulty was duration. A few months of absence could be understood. A year of reduced visibility could be forgiven. But the long continuation of withdrawal altered the public mood, especially as Britain itself was changing. Newspapers reached more readers. Urban crowds grew larger. Political discussion moved beyond the older circles of aristocratic government. The monarchy, which had gained strength from Victoria and Albert's visible family life, now seemed to be retreating from the very public that had learned to look toward it. A sovereign hidden behind mourning could not easily satisfy a society becoming more accustomed to spectacle. This did not mean that Victoria had ceased to reign. Her boxes still came, dispatches still received comments in her hand, prime ministers still had to manage her views, her dislikes, her preferences, and her sharp memory for previous promises. She continued to care about appointments, foreign affairs, church matters, military questions, and the conduct of her children. The throne had not gone empty. What had thinned was the ceremonial surface through which the ordinary subject felt the crown's existence. A constitutional monarch could influence from private rooms, but affection required more than influence. Memorials to Albert became one path by which Victoria's grief returned to public form. Statues, buildings, dedications, and written tributes allowed her to honor him without abandoning mourning. The Albert Memorial in London, later rising opposite the Royal Albert Hall, belonged to a broader culture of remembrance that Victoria encouraged with fierce devotion. She wanted the country to see what she believed it had not fully seen while Albert lived: his discipline, his intelligence, his usefulness, and his moral claim upon national gratitude. Stone and bronze became instruments of vindication. Such memorial culture also helped the monarchy solve a problem it could not name too bluntly. If Victoria would not resume the easy social visibility of her earlier reign, then public ritual could gather around Albert's memory and still place the Queen near the center of national feeling. A ceremony of dedication was not a ball. A memorial unveiling did not require the kind of lightness she had rejected. Grief itself could be ceremonial. Through these acts, sorrow gave the crown a way back into view without asking Victoria to appear as if Albert's death had been absorbed and left behind. Benjamin Disraeli understood this emotional and symbolic world better than many politicians. He possessed a theatrical gift for monarchy, not in the sense of empty flattery alone, but in his ability to speak to Victoria's sense of dignity, loss, and imperial meaning. His letters pleased her because they treated the crown as something more than an administrative inconvenience. He knew how to offer deference without seeming dull, imagination without seeming disorderly, and political service without stripping monarchy of its mystery. Victoria, who often judged ministers by tone as much as policy, responded warmly. Gladstone, by contrast, often wearied her. His moral earnestness, long explanations, and manner of addressing her could feel oppressive rather than respectful. He was a formidable statesman, and she could not simply dismiss him from history because she disliked his style. But the contrast with Disraeli mattered. Where Disraeli made her feel enthroned, Gladstone could make her feel lectured. A queen with strong opinions and a heightened sense of personal dignity did not easily forgive a minister who seemed to instruct where she wanted to be consulted. Disraeli's importance grew partly because he offered Victoria a political companionship suited to widowhood. He did not replace Albert, and no minister could have done so, but he gave language to the majesty of the crown at a time when critics were questioning its practical value. His imagination moved naturally toward empire, ceremony, loyalty, and the emotional power of institutions. Victoria's own instincts, sharpened by seclusion and memory, found something congenial there. A remote queen could be drawn back toward public meaning by a minister who made public meaning feel personal. Republican criticism, though never dominant enough to overthrow the monarchy, became more audible during these years. Some radicals and reformers argued that the crown cost too much and did too little. Others compared Victoria's absence unfavorably with the needs of a modern public institution. The question was not always revolutionary in tone. Sometimes it was practical. What did the country receive from a monarchy whose sovereign avoided many of its public duties? What place did inherited dignity hold in a society discussing reform, representation, taxation, empire, and the rights of citizens? The fact that such questions could be asked with new confidence showed how far the early glow of the reign had faded. Royal family events helped answer them in ways argument could not. Weddings, births, public services, and carefully managed appearances reminded the country that the monarchy was not only one grieving woman, but a dynasty. Princess Louise's marriage to the Marquis of Lorne in 1871 was especially notable because it joined one of Victoria's daughters to a British aristocrat rather than to a foreign prince. Public interest gathered around the event, and the Queen's participation helped soften the sense of complete withdrawal. Family ceremony could carry the crown into the public eye while remaining emotionally bearable for Victoria. The Prince of Wales also drew attention, though not always in ways his mother welcomed. Edward had charm, sociability, and an appetite for the public world that Victoria often distrusted. His illness with typhoid fever in 1871 caused national concern, and his recovery was marked by a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1872. Victoria attended, and the service became one of the important public moments in the slow restoration of royal visibility. It allowed the country to gather around gratitude rather than festivity, around family anxiety rather than political display. The form suited the Queen's limits and the public's need. That service at St. Paul's showed how carefully the crown could reappear. It did not require Victoria to abandon mourning or return to the social brightness of earlier decades. It placed her within a solemn national ritual connected to the life of her son and heir. London could see her, newspapers could report her, and the monarchy could feel present again without denying the emotional world in which she still lived. Public ceremony worked best for Victoria when it could be joined to duty, family, memory, or Thanksgiving. Mere display rarely moved her. John Brown remained close during this period, and his presence continued to unsettle parts of the court and public. Brown's service was practical, direct, and personally reassuring to Victoria, especially in Scotland. He managed aspects of her daily movement, attended her outdoors, and spoke to her with a plainness she valued. The resentment around him revealed the rigidity of rank within royal society. A servant could be devoted, useful, and trusted, yet still become controversial if his intimacy with the sovereign seemed to disturb the expected distance between station and favour. Victoria defended him because loyalty mattered to her more than courtly comfort. Her defence of Brown also revealed a pattern that had run through her life from Kensington onward. She attached herself intensely to those she believed had served her honestly, and she resisted pressure to surrender them. Leeson, Melbourne, Albert, and Brown belonged to very different parts of her life, but each in some way answered her early fear of manipulation and abandonment. Once Victoria trusted, she could make trust into a fortress. Those outside the fortress often found her stubborn. Those inside it received fierce protection. The monarchy's recovery was therefore uneven. Victoria did not transform suddenly into a constantly visible sovereign. She continued to avoid many occasions, preferred the residences where Albert's memory remained strongest, and guarded the private routines that made life bearable to her. Yet public appearances became more frequent, and the political danger of total withdrawal slowly lessened. Ministers learned to work around her habits. The family supplied additional figures for ceremonial life. Memorials, services, and selected events gave the public enough visibility to renew attachment. Disraeli's return to power in 1874 helped deepen this renewal. His government brought a tone of imperial confidence that appealed to Victoria, and his treatment of her as a sovereign of large symbolic importance pleased her after years of criticism and discomfort. He addressed her imagination as well as her office. For a queen who had felt misunderstood in grief and insufficiently appreciative of Albert's memory, Disraeli's courtly manner was more than flattery, it was recognition. He seemed to understand that monarchy survived through feeling as much as through law. This recognition did not mean Victoria regained political command. The development of parliamentary government continued. Parties, elections, cabinets, and the House of Commons shaped policy in ways no monarch could simply override, but symbolic strength mattered, and Disraeli helped restore that strength by giving Victoria a role that matched the scale of Britain's imperial self-image. She had been a widow in seclusion. She could also be presented as the sovereign of a world empire. That movement from private sorrow to imperial dignity would define the next chapter of her reign. Behind the restored ceremonies, Albert remained present. Victoria's rooms, clothing, habits, and memories still revolved around him. She did not come back to public life by leaving widowhood behind. She carried widowhood into public life and made it part of her authority. The country that had once grown impatient with her absence gradually learned to see the mourning queen as a figure of endurance. The image could be restrictive, even severe, but it possessed power. A young queen had once given monarchy freshness. The widow gave it gravity. By the middle of the 1870s, the crown had reappeared enough to take on a new imperial form. Britain's rule in India had already passed from company to crown after the upheaval of 1857, but the symbolic language of that rule was about to change. Disraeli understood the force of titles, and Victoria cared deeply about rank, recognition, and the dignity of her office. The woman who had withdrawn after Albert's death would now receive a name that placed empire directly inside the royal style. Public monarchy had returned through mourning, memorial, ceremony, and ministerial imagination, and it was about to speak in a more imperial voice. Chapter 12. Empress of India. The title Empress of India did not create Britain's rule over India, but it changed the way that rule gathered around Victoria's name. Since the rebellion of 1857 and the transfer of authority from the East India Company to the Crown, India had already stood in a more direct formal relationship to the British monarchy. Government still moved through ministers, viceroys, councils, soldiers, civil servants, judges, local rulers, and the immense administrative machinery of empire. Victoria did not govern India from Windsor as a personal dominion, yet symbols matter in monarchy. And in empire they can matter with unusual force. A title could give distance a ceremonial shape. Benjamin Disraeli understood this. He had long possessed a theatrical intelligence about institutions, and by the 1870s he saw that Britain's empire required language equal to its scale. Victoria, too, cared about rank, precedence, and the visible dignity of the crown. She had watched other rulers hold imperial titles on the continent, and she disliked any suggestion that her position was narrower than the world attached to it. To be Queen of the United Kingdom was already a great office. To rule, even symbolically, over India through the ordinary royal title seemed to her insufficient for the magnitude of the imperial connection. The Royal Titles Act of 1876 supplied the legal means. It authorized the addition of Empress of India to Victoria's titles, giving official form to a change Disraeli had encouraged and the Queen welcomed. The measure was debated, and not everyone admired it. Critics saw vanity, theatricality, and imperial inflation. Some worried that the language of empire sat uneasily beside Britain's constitutional monarchy. The older English suspicion of grand titles had not vanished. To supporters, however, the title recognized political reality and gave Indian princes, officials, and subjects a more fitting ceremonial relationship to the sovereign. Victoria's pleasure in the title was genuine. It answered something personal as well as institutional. After years in which grief had withdrawn her from much public life, imperial dignity offered a form of recognition that did not require lightness, sociability, or festive ease. It allowed her to be remote and powerful at the same time. The widow in black could stand as the motherly sovereign of a vast empire without ceasing to be the mourner of Albert. Disraeli's gift to her was not only a phrase in the royal style, it was a new way for the crown to appear large while the Queen herself remained physically distant. Distance was central to the whole arrangement. Victoria never visited India. She would never see Delhi, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, the princely courts, the army cantonments, the hill stations, the railway lines, the civil offices, or the villages in which British rule was experienced very differently from the way it was described in London. Her India came through letters, reports, paintings, gifts, servants, officials, ceremonies, and the language of loyal address. Empire entered her life through objects and documents before it entered through direct contact. The title made the distance grander, but it did not remove it. The Delhi Durbar of 1877 gave the new imperial style its ceremonial announcement in India. Lord Lytton, the viceroy, presided over the gathering, which assembled Indian princes, British officials, soldiers, and representatives of imperial authority in an elaborate public form. Victoria was absent, but absence was not allowed to weaken the spectacle. Her name, titles, messages, and symbols stood in her place. The proclamation of her as Empress of India turned ceremony into substitution. The sovereign's body remained in Britain, while imperial ritual made her present through words, banners, salutes, and arranged homage. Such ceremonial arrangements had a double meaning. To the British, they displayed order, loyalty, and the grandeur of an empire governed under the crown. To many Indian rulers, participation involved calculations of status, survival, negotiation, and recognition within an imperial hierarchy they had not designed. Princely rank mattered enormously, and the British understood that titles, seating, honors, gun salutes, robes, and forms of address could be used to organize power. Empire did not rule by soldiers alone. It ruled also through ceremonies that told every participant where he stood. The Durbar's timing carried a harsher background. The later 1870s were marked by famine in parts of India, especially the Great Famine of 1876-78, whose human cost was vast. The ceremony of imperial dignity existed alongside hunger, administrative choices, market pressures, and arguments over responsibility. A calm telling should neither turn the chapter into accusation alone nor allow spectacle to cover suffering. The point is steadier than that. The same imperial system that could gather princes and officials into elaborate homage also governed territories where millions lived close to scarcity and where policy could shape life and death at great scale. Victoria's own understanding of India was paternal and protective in the language of her time. She often wished to be seen as a just sovereign above racial hatred, religious interference, or vindictive policy. Her proclamation after 1858 had emphasized non-interference in religion and equal protection under law, and she continued to care about such language. She disliked crude contempt toward Indian peoples and could take interest in individual Indians who entered her circle. Yet benevolent feeling did not alter the hierarchy of empire. A sovereign could speak of care while presiding over a structure built on domination. This tension ran through the imperial monarchy she came to embody. Victoria's image was used to soften rule, to suggest that the empire's authority flowed from a maternal and morally serious figure rather than only from conquest, taxation, military power, and administrative command. The Queen herself was not cynical in this role. She believed deeply in duty, loyalty, and protection. But institutions often use sincere feeling for purposes larger and harder than the feeling itself. Her personal sympathy could be real, while the imperial order attached to her name remained unequal. Indian princes occupied a central place in this symbolic world. Many retained titles, courts, revenues, and local authority under British supremacy. Their relationship to Victoria as Empress offered a language of loyalty that both acknowledged their dignity and marked their subordination. Gifts moved between courts, addresses were sent, honors were granted. Ceremonies arranged precedence with great care. A ruler might be honored in the Queen's name and still be contained by the power that honored him. The velvet surface of ceremony covered a framework of supervision. Disraeli's politics made this imperial language especially attractive to Victoria. He treated empire as an enlargement of monarchy's emotional reach. To him, the crown could help bind together a state that was no longer only an island kingdom, but the center of a global system. Victoria appreciated the scale of that imagination. She had disliked much of the criticism directed at her during her years of seclusion, and Disraeli gave her a role that seemed majestic rather than defensive. In his hands, the Queen's remoteness could become mystery, her age could become endurance, and her widowhood could become dignity. The title also altered how Britain imagined itself. Many subjects in Britain had little direct knowledge of India beyond newspapers, exhibitions, military stories, missionary reports, trade goods, and imperial imagery. Empress of India compressed all that distance into a phrase attached to a familiar monarch. It made empire sound personal. A vast administrative and military structure could be imagined through the figure of an elderly queen whose portrait appeared in homes, offices, schools, and public buildings. The emotional habits of loyalty could be extended across geography through a name. Material culture helped this extension. Medals, proclamations, portraits, official seals, court documents, commemorative objects, and illustrated newspapers carried the imperial title outward. The phrase appeared in contexts where people might never read an act of parliament or a dispatch from the India office. Monarchy has always depended on repetition, and the imperial title gained force through repeated appearance. Each printed formula made the connection between Victoria and India feel more natural than it had been before. Paper did part of the empire's ceremonial work. Victoria's personal interest in India deepened later through people as well as documents. Indian attendants entered her household in the later years of her reign, most famously Abdul Karim, who would become her munshi and teach her Hindustani. That relationship belongs more fully to the final decades of her life, but its roots lay in the imperial imagination, strengthened by the title of Empress. Victoria wanted contact with India that felt personal rather than merely administrative. She wanted language, stories, faces, and loyal service near her. The desire was human, though it existed within the unequal conditions that made such service possible. The British public did not receive the imperial turn in one unified way. Conservatives often found in it a language of pride and continuity. Liberals and radicals could be more suspicious, seeing the title as ornamental, authoritarian, or foreign to British constitutional habits. Some critics believed Disraeli was encouraging a style of monarchy too grand for a parliamentary country. Others thought the empire itself required stronger moral scrutiny. The argument over a title therefore became an argument over what Britain was becoming. Was it a constitutional kingdom with overseas possessions, or an imperial power whose monarchy should speak in imperial terms? Victoria did not share the discomfort of those who found the title excessive. To her, it affirmed rather than distorted the dignity of the crown. It also gave her a relationship, however symbolic, with subjects who did not share the religious, legal, or social world of Britain. She liked to imagine herself as standing above local prejudice and bureaucratic harshness, a sovereign whose justice could be appealed to in spirit if not always in practice. This image of the Queen as distant protector became one of the emotional foundations of imperial monarchy. Its distance was both its strength and its weakness. The weakness lay in the gap between imperial language and imperial life. India was not governed by maternal feeling, and the daily experience of British rule varied sharply across region, class, caste, religion, gender, and political circumstance. Some Indian elites benefited from cooperation with the Raj. Others resented subordination, exclusion, racial arrogance, economic extraction, or the narrowing of authority. Peasants, soldiers, merchants, lawyers, princes, clerks, and reformers encountered empire through different doors. Victoria's title could not make those encounters one story. It could only give them one sovereign name. Still, the title endured because it served many purposes at once. It pleased Victoria. It satisfied Disraeli's taste for imperial symbolism. It offered Indian princes a ceremonial relationship to the crown. It strengthened the monarchy's global image. It helped Britain imagine empire as loyalty rather than only administration. The phrase Empress of India carried all these functions in a compact official form. Few words in Victoria's reign did more symbolic work. In the years after 1876, Victoria's public identity became increasingly imperial. She remained Queen of the United Kingdom, still bound to Parliament, parties, churches, family duties, and the habits of British constitutional life, but the imperial title widened the frame through which she was seen. The girl who had once been managed in Kensington now stood, in official language, over territories and peoples far beyond anything her childhood household could have imagined. That enlargement did not make her more personally powerful in the simple sense. It made her more symbolically useful to a state whose reach had grown enormous. The imperial title also deepened the importance of her ministers. Disraeli had given Victoria a language she loved, but no queen could keep such a language alive without governments, policies, and parliamentary realities behind it. Gladstone would return, bringing a very different moral and political temper into the Queen's working life. The affection Victoria felt for one minister and the irritation she felt toward another could not stop the movement of elections or the needs of party government. After the imperial enlargement of her style came a reminder of constitutional limits, and the next struggle would unfold through the men who served her, displeased her, flattered her, and constrained her. Chapter 13. Disraeli, Gladstone, and the Limits of Preference. Benjamin Disraeli pleased Victoria because he understood that monarchy lived partly in language. He did not treat the crown as an inconvenience left over from an older constitution, nor as a ceremonial shell around the real work of government. In his letters and audiences, he gave the Queen the feeling that her office still possessed height, colour, and historical meaning. After years in which criticism had followed her withdrawal, and after a long widowhood that made ordinary public cheerfulness impossible, Disraeli's manner offered something she valued greatly. He made reverence feel intelligent. This mattered more than flattery alone. Victoria had known many kinds of attention during her life: Conroy's manipulation, Melbourne's affectionate guidance, Albert's disciplined partnership, and the public's changing mixture of sympathy and impatience. Disraeli's attention belonged to politics, but it also touched her imagination. He addressed her as a sovereign whose feelings, memories, and symbols mattered to the state. He knew that a monarch did not need to govern directly in order to feel diminished when ministers treated the crown as a formality. His courtesy reassured her that constitutional limits did not have to mean personal irrelevance. Gladstone approached the crown in a different spirit. He was earnest, religiously serious, intellectually forceful, and often convinced that public life required moral explanation. His audiences with Victoria could become long and taxing, because he believed in persuading through fullness. To the Queen, this often felt less like consultation than instruction. She did not deny his ability, and she could not prevent his rise when politics brought him power, but she found him difficult in temperament. Where Disraeli seemed to raise the throne by speaking upward to it, Gladstone seemed to press upon it with argument. The contrast between the two men has sometimes been made too simple. Disraeli was not merely a charming courtier, and Gladstone was not merely a tiresome moralist. Both were formidable politicians, both reshaped party life, and both understood the expanding electorate in ways Victoria herself did not always welcome. Disraeli could be calculating beneath his courtesy. Gladstone could be principled in ways that made his seriousness more than vanity. Their difference mattered at court because Victoria experienced politics through personality as well as policy, and personality could colour her judgment long before a bill reached its final form. Her preference for Disraeli became especially strong during his premiership in the 1870s. He had given her the title Empress of India, supported an imperial language that suited her sense of royal dignity, and treated her grief and age as part of majesty rather than as obstacles to public usefulness. He wrote to her with phrases that others might have found extravagant, but she found them respectful. His imagination turned the crown into something warm, ancient, and still necessary. At a time when Britain was industrial, argumentative, parliamentary, and increasingly democratic in pressure, Disraeli allowed Victoria to feel that monarchy had not been reduced to paperwork. Yet paperwork remained the daily substance of rule. The Queen's boxes continued to arrive, carrying cabinet decisions, diplomatic dispatches, church appointments, military questions, colonial reports, and proposed honours. Victoria read with attention, wrote comments, objected sharply when displeased, and remembered earlier commitments with great tenacity. She was not a passive ornament placed at the end of a process. Ministers had to reckon with her opinions, especially when matters touched the army, foreign policy, empire, appointments, or the dignity of the crown. Influence, however, was not command. That distinction became clearer as parliamentary government matured. Elections determined ministries, parties organized opinion, cabinets depended on majorities. The monarch had rights of consultation, warning, and encouragement, but those rights operated inside a political world that no longer belonged to royal will. Victoria could dislike Gladstone intensely and still receive him as Prime Minister when the electorate and Parliament made him necessary. She could admire Disraeli and still lose him to illness, defeat, or political change. The crown had endurance, but not freedom from the arithmetic of parliamentary life. Disraeli's final years carried both triumph and fragility. His imperial policy, the Royal Titles Act, and his handling of foreign affairs gave Victoria much to admire. The Congress of Berlin in 1878, where Disraeli and Lord Salisbury helped negotiate a settlement after the Russo-Turkish War, strengthened his reputation with those who believed Britain had defended its interests with firmness and style. Victoria rejoiced in such moments because they seemed to place Britain, empire, and monarchy in one dignified frame. Disraeli returned with honours, and the Queen's affection for him deepened further. But age and health were working against him. Disraeli, created Earl of Beaconsfield, moved increasingly as a figure of late-career prestige rather than youthful energy. His letters still charmed Victoria and his imagination still suited her, but the political ground beneath him was not secure. Economic trouble, imperial strain, and criticism of his foreign and colonial policies weakened the conservative position. Politics did not preserve a minister because a queen admired him. In 1880, Gladstone's Liberals won a decisive victory, and Victoria had to accept the return of the man she least wished to see in power. Gladstone's return was a constitutional lesson delivered through personal discomfort. Victoria disliked his manner, distrusted some of his policies, and disliked the emotional atmosphere he brought into audiences. He seemed to her too eager to explain, too ready to moralize, and insufficiently sensitive to the crown's dignity. Yet he came not as a supplicant asking for her favor, but as the leader able to form a government. The Queen might feel reluctance, but reluctance had to wear the forms of acceptance. A sovereign's personal preference could be strong, but it had to pass through the narrow gate of constitutional practice. The audiences between Victoria and Gladstone became famous for their strain. He spoke at length, sometimes with papers in hand, unfolding arguments that he believed necessary. Victoria listened, objected, endured, and sometimes wrote afterward with irritation. The difficulty was not only that they disagreed, it was that their temperaments were badly matched. Gladstone's moral pressure met Victoria's guarded pride. His need to explain met her desire to be respected without being lectured. Their meetings remind a historian that constitutional monarchy was conducted not by abstract offices alone, but by tired bodies, tones of voice, habits of speech, and the patience available on a given day. Ireland intensified their conflict. The Irish question had troubled British politics throughout Victoria's reign through famine, land agitation, religious grievance, nationalist organisation, and the demand for self-government. Victoria's instincts were strongly unionist. She associated the integrity of the United Kingdom with stability, loyalty, and imperial strength. Gladstone, especially in the 1880s, came to believe that Home Rule offered a necessary answer to Irish claims. For the Queen, this was alarming. To her, Home Rule seemed less like reconciliation than the weakening of a kingdom whose unity she was sworn to preserve. The first Home Rule crisis in 1886 placed the limits of royal influence in plain view. Gladstone introduced a bill to grant Ireland its own legislature while keeping it within the empire, and the proposal split the Liberal Party. Victoria opposed the direction strongly, but the struggle was fought in Parliament, parties, newspapers, constituencies, and cabinet rooms. The bill was defeated and Gladstone fell, but the defeat did not come because Victoria had commanded it. It came through political division and parliamentary resistance. Her feelings belonged to the climate of opposition, not to a royal veto. Lord Salisbury's conservative governments gave Victoria a more congenial political atmosphere after Gladstone's fall. Salisbury was aristocratic, cautious, imperial, and less personally grating to her than Gladstone. He did not have Disraeli's imaginative intimacy with the Queen, but he offered steadiness and a view of empire and union closer to her own instincts. Under Salisbury, late Victorian politics often felt to Victoria less threatening, though not free from difficulty. The state was growing more complex, and no prime minister could return the monarchy to a simpler age. The Queen's relationship with ministers during these decades shows both her persistence and her limits. She remained active in correspondence. She pressed views on appointments, military reforms, foreign affairs, and the conduct of empire. She cared about the marriages and futures of her children, the reputation of Albert, the behavior of the Prince of Wales, and the honor due to the crown. She disliked being surprised by ministers and objected when she believed procedure had been neglected. In these ways, her sovereignty had daily texture, but she could not govern against the political nation. Her dislike of Gladstone did not stop him from returning again. In 1892, after another Liberal victory, he formed his final ministry and returned once more to the Queen, whose patience he had tested for decades. By then, Victoria was old, and Gladstone was older still. Their relationship had become almost a constitutional endurance test. He brought back the Irish question with a second Home Rule bill, and she remained deeply hostile to the policy. The bill passed the Commons, but was defeated in the House of Lords in 1893. Once again, the Crown's preference aligned with resistance, but the deciding machinery was parliamentary and institutional. Disraeli's memory, by contrast, remained golden to her. After his death in 1881, Victoria mourned him with real feeling. She had lost not another Albert, but a minister who had spoken to the parts of monarchy that others neglected. His death deprived her of a political companion who made her feel understood in dignity, age, empire, and widowhood. The affection was personal, but it also reveals something about the late Victorian crown. Victoria wanted ministers who treated symbols as real forces. Disraeli had done that. Gladstone, for all his moral seriousness, often seemed to her to treat symbols as things to be instructed. This preference did not make Victoria foolish. It made her human inside a constitutional role that required more neutrality than human feeling easily supplies. Every monarch has opinions, habits of trust, memories of injury, and private measures of character. The difference is that a constitutional monarch must learn which feelings can be acted upon, which can be expressed, and which must be endured in silence or softened through form. Victoria did not always soften them gracefully. Her letters could be sharp, her judgments could be stubborn, but the structure around her usually held. Publicly, the monarchy benefited from the very limits that frustrated her. Because Victoria could not rule by preference, the Crown survived governments she disliked. Because she had to receive Gladstone, the monarchy remained above the party struggle even when the woman inside the office was not above irritation. Because Disraeli's favours could not permanently secure conservative rule, the Crown did not become only the property of one political camp. The discipline was imperfect, but it mattered. Constitutional monarchy survived partly by forcing private feeling into public restraint. The country around these ministerial struggles was changing rapidly. The Reform Acts expanded the electorate. Organised parties reached further into towns and counties. Newspapers made political disagreement more immediate. Trade unions, Irish nationalists, nonconformists, imperial advocates, social reformers, and conservative defenders of hierarchy all pressed upon public life. Victoria had begun her reign in a political world of aristocratic management and limited representation. By her later decades, the political nation had become broader, louder, and harder for any monarch to shape directly. A queen could still matter greatly without being able to master the age that bore her name. This is why her relationships with Disraeli and Gladstone are more than court anecdotes. They show the Crown adapting to modern politics through personality, irritation, affection, procedure, and endurance. Victoria's feelings were vivid, but the office required continuity across men she loved, men she disliked, men who flattered her, men who exhausted her and men who carried policies she feared. The reign did not become impersonal, it became constitutional enough to survive personality. Beyond ministers, another form of politics was spreading through Victoria's own family. Her children had married into royal houses across Europe, and her grandchildren were beginning to occupy positions that would shape the future of the continent. In one direction stood parliament, party, and the limits of preference at home. In another stood dynasty, marriage, and the hope that family ties might soften international rivalry. Victoria had learned that she could not keep a disliked prime minister from office when politics required him. She would also learn that even a grandmother's web of royal kinship could not make Europe obedient to family feeling. Chapter 14. The Grandmother of Europe. 9 children gave Victoria a family large enough to become a political map. In the earlier years of her marriage, those children had belonged mostly to the nursery, the schoolroom, the family table, and the ordered domestic world that Albert tried to shape with such seriousness. As they grew, their futures carried them outward into marriages, courts, languages, ceremonies, and obligations that stretched far beyond Britain. The royal child did not simply leave home. A royal child entered another house, another constitution, another set of dynastic hopes, and often another country's unsettled future. Victoria's eldest daughter, the Princess Royal, known in the family as Vicky, was the first and most important example of this outward movement. She was clever, lively, intellectually quick, and especially cherished by Albert, who saw in her a seriousness of mind that suited his own hopes for education and reform. Her marriage in 1858 to Prince Frederick William of Prussia joined the British royal family to one of the most significant rising powers in Europe. It was an affectionate match, but it was also heavy with expectation. Albert hoped that Vicky and Frederick might help guide Prussia toward constitutional liberalism and moral seriousness, carrying something of the Coburg British ideal into Berlin. The marriage was therefore watched with more than parental feeling. Prussia was not merely another court in the old dynastic network. It was a state with military traditions, conservative elites, and a future that would soon become central to German unification. Vicky entered that world young, intelligent, and strongly shaped by her parents' ideals. She wrote home constantly, sometimes with political hope, sometimes with frustration, and sometimes with the loneliness of a daughter whose adopted country did not easily become her own. Her letters to Victoria formed a long thread between mother and daughter, one made of affection, advice, complaint, and political anxiety. Albert lived long enough to see Vicky married, but not long enough to see the later consequences of the world into which she had gone. After his death, Victoria's attachment to her children became even more intense and often more possessive. She wanted them near, or at least emotionally loyal across distance. Marriage challenged that desire because dynastic marriage required departure. A daughter could remain beloved and still become subject to another court's customs. A son could remain heir and still develop a life his mother did not fully approve. Family feeling in a royal house never moved freely. It passed through rank, etiquette, religion, diplomacy, and the expectations of states. Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, carried a different burden. As the eldest son, he was the heir, but Victoria did not trust him with the same confidence Albert had placed in Vicky. Bertie was sociable, charming, pleasure-loving, and often impatient with the strict educational schemes his parents had designed for him. To Albert, and later to Victoria through Albert's memory, these traits seemed dangerous in a future king. Victoria's long widowhood sharpened her criticism of him. She associated him with anxiety, disappointment, and the painful final months of Albert's life. And this association made their relationship more difficult than simple motherly affection could repair. Bertie's marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863 gave the monarchy a public occasion of great popularity. Alexandra was beautiful, gracious, and quickly admired by the British public. The match also drew Britain's royal family into the tense politics of Northern Europe. because Denmark's position against Prussia and Austria soon became a matter of diplomatic concern. Victoria's family connections did not produce one clear political loyalty. Her eldest daughter was married into Prussia. Her daughter-in-law came from Denmark. The family table, if imagined across borders, already contained the rival claims of European politics. This was the hidden difficulty of dynastic marriage. It promised connection, understanding, and influence, yet it also placed loved ones on different sides of disputes they could not control. When war came between states linked by family ties, letters could not undo mobilization, and affection could not soften every cabinet. Victoria often believed that family feeling should count for something in international affairs. Sometimes it did. Personal relations could open channels, temper language, and preserve courtesies. But armies, ministers, parliaments, ambitions, and national movements obeyed forces larger than kinship. Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter, married Prince Louis of Hesse in 1862. Alice had a gentler, more practical seriousness than some of her siblings, and during Albert's final illness she had been a comfort to her mother. Her marriage took her to a smaller German court than Vicky's, but not to a life free from strain. She was involved in nursing, charitable work, and family duty, and her life carried its own share of sorrow. Her death in 1878 from diphtheria deeply wounded Victoria. The loss was especially painful because Alice had been one of the children who had seemed emotionally closest to the Queen during the terrible passage of 1861. Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia in 1874, extending Victoria's family network into the Romanov world. The marriage brought prestige, but also difficulty, because rank and precedence between British and Russian expectations created friction. Maria was the daughter of Tsar Alexander II and did not always find the British court satisfying. Victoria, deeply sensitive to matters of dignity, could be irritated by the demands and assumptions that came with a daughter-in-law from another imperial family. Dynastic marriage promised alliance, but it also imported pride from one court into another. Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, a match that allowed her to remain relatively near her mother. This suited Victoria, who disliked losing daughters completely to foreign courts. Louise, more artistic and independent in temperament, married the Marquis of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll, in 1871, a marriage notable because he was a British subject rather than a foreign prince. The choice drew public interest and some surprise, but it also helped connect the royal family more closely to British aristocratic life. Louise's marriage suggested that the royal children's futures did not all have to follow one dynastic pattern. Arthur, Duke of Connaught, entered military life and later married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. Leopold, Duke of Albany, carried the burden of haemophilia, an inherited condition that shaped his life with pain, restriction, and maternal anxiety. Victoria could be protective to the point of constraint, and Leopold often struggled for independence under the weight of illness and royal supervision. His marriage to Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont gave him a brief family life before his death in 1884. The private sorrow of that death also carried dynastic consequence, because haemophilia would pass through descendants into other royal houses. Beatrice, the youngest child, remained closest to Victoria in the later years. After Albert's death, the Queen increasingly depended on her companionship, and Beatrice's desire to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg caused a painful conflict. Victoria resisted because Beatrice had become part of the emotional structure of her widowhood. To lose her youngest daughter to marriage felt like another removal from the household of memory. A compromise was eventually reached. Beatrice married, but she and Henry remained near the Queen. Even in old age, Victoria's family policy still bore the mark of Kensington reversed. She had once been the child held too close. Now she struggled not to hold too closely those she loved. Through these marriages, Victoria became what later generations called the grandmother of Europe. The phrase sounds soft, almost domestic, but it describes a serious political fact. Her descendants entered the royal houses of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Norway, Spain, and other parts of Europe through direct or later marriages. Family portraits gathered children and grandchildren in arrangements that seemed to promise continuity across borders. Names, faces, uniforms, dresses, and decorations filled the image with harmony. Outside the photograph, however, Europe was changing in ways no grandmother could command. The most consequential of Victoria's grandchildren was Wilhelm, the son of Vicky and Frederick, born in 1859. He would become Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. As a child and young man, Wilhelm stood at the crossing point of British and Prussian inheritance, admired and worried over by relatives who saw in him intelligence, vanity, insecurity, ambition, and injury. His relationship with his mother was difficult, shaped partly by politics, partly by temperament, and partly by the expectations placed on him as heir to a newly powerful empire. Victoria loved him as a grandson, but family affection did not make him politically gentle. German unification altered the meaning of Vicky's marriage. When Prussia defeated Austria in 1866 and France in 1870-71, the balance of Europe changed. The German Empire was proclaimed in 1871, and Vicky became crown princess in a state far stronger and more militarized than the reforming Prussia Albert had once hoped to influence through her. Frederick, her husband, shared liberal sympathies, but his time as emperor in 1888 would last only a few months before his death. Wilhelm then came to the throne. Victoria lived long enough to see her grandson become German emperor, and with him a more restless European future took shape. The family web also touched Russia through Alfred's marriage and through later descendants. It touched Spain through the spread of Victoria's bloodline and, tragically, through haemophilia. It touched smaller courts where British royal daughters and granddaughters carried habits of religion, language, education, and domestic order into new settings. These connections made Victoria's family seem almost continental in scale, yet the scale could mislead. A family network was not the same as a system of peace. It could create correspondence, sympathy, visits, and shared mourning. But it could not dissolve national interest. Victoria herself often treated family events as matters of state and state events as matters of family. She wrote intensely, advised constantly, judged marriages carefully, and followed the births, illnesses, quarrels, and futures of descendants with remarkable attention. The number of letters alone suggests the labor of kinship in her later life. She was not a distant matriarch content to be honored on ceremonial occasions. She wanted information, obedience, affection, and recognition from the family she had created with Albert. Motherhood remained active long after the nursery had emptied. Her authority within the family, however, was uneven. Children and grandchildren loved her, feared her, resisted her, and negotiated with her. Some accepted her advice more readily than others. Some lived near enough to be drawn into her daily routines. Others belonged to courts where local pressures mattered more than letters from Windsor or Balmoral. Victoria could insist, scold, bless, withhold approval, and remember grievances, but she could not fully govern adult children scattered across Europe. Even as grandmother, she met the limits of preference. The public saw the family in more polished form. Photographs and engravings presented Victoria surrounded by descendants, a visual answer to the succession anxiety that had preceded her birth. Where George III's later family had seemed disorderly and uncertain, Victoria's descendants suggested abundance and continuity. The old queen seated among children and grandchildren offered an image of stability that suited late Victorian monarchy. It made empire look domestic, Europe look familial, and time itself seemed gathered around one seated figure. That image had power because it was partly true. Victoria had produced a vast family, and many of them did stand close to the future of European monarchy. She had known the deaths of husband, mother, children, and friends, yet she remained the central reference point for a sprawling dynasty. Her memory connected generations. Her letters crossed borders. Her approval mattered in marriage negotiations and family ceremonies. When relatives gathered around her, they entered not only a grandmother's presence, but the presence of the century's most enduring sovereign. Still, the image was calmer than the reality. Her family carried illness, rivalry, incompatible national loyalties, unhappy marriages, political frustration, and the slow approach of conflicts that would outlive her. The descendants who seemed to bind Europe together would, in the next century, stand within a continent moving toward catastrophe. Victoria did not see the full result, and it would be unfair to place later disasters upon her family policy alone. Dynastic marriage was an old instrument working inside a modern world that had begun to obey other forces. By the final decades of her life, Victoria's role as grandmother joined her role as empress, widow, and queen. She was at once intimate and distant, domestic and imperial, a woman of letters and memories whose descendants occupied palaces across Europe. The child once watched in Kensington had become the elder around whom others arranged themselves, yet even this authority remained symbolic more than commanding. She could gather family, but not history itself. The next great display of her reign would gather not only descendants and courtiers, but colonies, soldiers, ministers, crowds, and messages from across the empire, as Britain marked the astonishing endurance of the Queen who had outlived almost everyone who began the story with her. Chapter 15. Jubilee Britain. June 1887 gave Britain a queen who had reigned for 50 years. The girl who had received the crown at Kensington before breakfast had become an elderly sovereign whose life now seemed to stretch across the memories of several generations. Many of the ministers, courtiers, relatives, critics, servants, and friends who had shaped the beginning of her reign were gone. Albert had been dead for more than 25 years. Melbourne belonged to a much earlier world. Peel, Palmerston, Disraeli, and so many others had passed into history, while Victoria remained, smaller in body than in public meaning, carrying the crown through a Britain transformed by railways, industry, empire, newspapers, reform, and war. Her longevity had become a political fact. The Golden Jubilee was not only a celebration of age, it was an answer to earlier doubts about the monarchy's visibility, purpose, and emotional hold upon the country. In the years after Albert's death, criticism had gathered around Victoria's withdrawal. By 1887, however, her continued reign had acquired a different power. Absence had not destroyed monarchy. Mourning had hardened into an image of endurance. The sovereign who had once seemed too hidden now seemed almost immovable, a living connection between the uncertain young kingdom of 1837 and the imperial Britain of the late 19th century. Time itself had done some of the crown's work. The ceremonies of the Golden Jubilee were arranged to make that endurance visible. There were services, processions, addresses, banquets, illuminations, and public gatherings across Britain and the Empire. Westminster Abbey, the streets of London, and the ceremonial routes of the capital became stages upon which the monarchy could be seen again. Victoria did not move through these events with youthful ease, and no one expected her to. Her age was part of the meaning. The point was not that she seemed untouched by time, but that time had marked her and left her still reigning. Crowds mattered greatly. A monarchy can exist in law without crowds, but it cannot easily thrive in imagination without them. The London public came out in large numbers, and reports of loyal display travelled through newspapers to those who could not stand in the streets themselves. The railway age had changed the scale of public ceremony. People, messages, printed images, and descriptions moved more widely than they had at the time of Victoria's accession. A royal procession no longer belonged only to those who saw it from a window or pavement. It could be described, illustrated, discussed, and remembered across the country within days. At the heart of the Jubilee stood a careful blending of family, state, and empire. Victoria's children and grandchildren gave the occasion dynastic breadth, while ministers and officials gave it constitutional form. Foreign envoys and royal relatives connected the celebration to Europe. Colonial representatives and imperial addresses connected it to territories far beyond Britain. The Queen's body remained in one carriage, in one city, on one sequence of ceremonial routes, but the meaning arranged around her extended across oceans. Late Victorian monarchy worked by making a single person appear to hold together many distances at once. The service of Thanksgiving at Westminster Abbey gave the celebration its most solemn centre. Victoria had been crowned there in 1838 as a young woman still learning how to stand beneath the crown's weight. Nearly half a century later, she returned as the longest reigning British sovereign up to that time, surrounded not by the fragile hopes of a new reign, but by the accumulated evidence of survival. The Abbey's ancient setting allowed the Jubilee to speak in the language of continuity. Stone, prayer, music, robes, and procession gave the monarchy an old frame for a modern imperial age. Victoria herself was moved by the occasion. She had always cared about loyalty, and the public affection shown during the Jubilee answered a need that remained strong in her old age. Praise did not make her less stubborn, less opinionated, or less wounded by earlier criticism, but it reassured her that the country still recognized her service. For a woman who had devoted so much of her inner life to Albert's memory, the Jubilee also carried a private echo. She believed that he had helped make her reign worthy, and public honor paid to her could be felt, in part, as delayed honor paid to him. The Golden Jubilee also helped settle the restored form of public monarchy. The Queen did not need to return to the social brightness of her youth. She did not need to become a constantly visible ruler or abandon the black dress and habits of mourning that had defined her for decades. Instead, the monarchy adapted around her age, sorrow, and ceremonial selectiveness. It learned to use rare appearances more heavily. When Victoria came before the public, the event carried the force of scarcity. Absence, once damaging, had become part of her aura. Across the empire, the Jubilee was marked in many different ways. Cities held celebrations, officials sent addresses, churches and public buildings conducted services, and colonial governments tied local loyalty to the Queen's long reign. In India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Cape, and other parts of Britain's imperial world, Victoria's name became the center of official language about unity and allegiance. The empire was not one experience, and the meaning of Jubilee loyalty differed greatly depending on who was speaking, who was compelled to speak, and who was excluded from the celebration's benefits. Still, the public language of the occasion presented empire as a family of peoples gathered around a sovereign mother. That language was powerful because it softened domination into relationship. Victoria was repeatedly imagined as maternal, protective, and morally serious, a figure above the rougher instruments of imperial rule. The image did not erase coercion, racial hierarchy, economic extraction, or political subordination. It made them easier for many British subjects to imagine as part of an ordered imperial mission. The Queen, who rarely traveled beyond Europe, could become emotionally present in places she never saw. Portraits, proclamations, medals, school ceremonies, official speeches, and public holidays carried her outward. The Jubilee moment also belonged to a changing media world. Photographs of Victoria, engravings of processions, newspaper accounts, commemorative prints, and souvenirs allowed the public to possess pieces of the occasion. Earlier generations had known monarchs through coins, proclamations, painted portraits, and occasional appearances. Late Victorian subjects knew their queen through an expanding world of reproduction. Her face, aged and familiar, could be placed in homes, shops, offices, classrooms, and colonial buildings. The public did not need to meet her to recognize her. Recognition itself became a form of loyalty. By 1897, the Diamond Jubilee carried this logic even further. 60 years on the throne made Victoria not merely a long-reigning monarch, but a phenomenon of historical endurance. Britain had changed almost beyond recognition since 1837. The electorate was larger, the party system more organized, the empire more expansive, the cities more crowded, the press more powerful, and technology more woven into daily life. Victoria had not directed all these changes, and in many cases she had watched them with caution rather than enthusiasm. Yet, because they happened under her reign, her name attached itself to them. An age had become Victorian partly because she had remained long enough to lend it a continuous label. The Diamond Jubilee procession on June 23, 1897, was arranged as a spectacle of empire. Colonial premiers attended. Troops from across the empire appeared in London. Representatives of many territories moved through the capital in an order designed to show breadth, loyalty, and imperial reach. The procession did not merely celebrate Victoria's age, it displayed the world over which Britain claimed authority. London became, for that day, the ceremonial centre of a global empire made visible through uniforms, banners, mounted troops, carriages, and carefully arranged precedence. Victoria, now old and physically limited, took part from her carriage. She did not need to speak loudly or move vigorously. Her presence was enough. The crowd saw not a young ruler performing power, but an aged queen who had become power's memory. Around her moved the signs of empire, soldiers from distant colonies, Indian cavalry, colonial statesmen, British regiments, royal relatives, and the administrative dignity of a state that believed its reach to be unmatched. The procession order itself told a story. It placed difference under imperial arrangement and made hierarchy appear as ceremony. The use of troops from across the empire gave the Jubilee a visual force that printed language alone could not provide. Men from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and other imperial regions appeared in the capital of the power that claimed their loyalty. To British spectators, their presence could seem thrilling, exotic, reassuring, and grand. To a more careful eye, it also revealed the inequality of the imperial structure. The empire was being celebrated through the bodies of people whose political rights within that empire were far from equal. The procession showed unity, but it also showed possession. Victoria's emotional response to the Diamond Jubilee was one of gratitude and fatigue. She was old enough to know that public enthusiasm could be overwhelming as well as comforting. The day required physical endurance, and her health no longer allowed the easy ceremonial stamina of earlier years, yet she understood the occasion's importance. She gave thanks for the loyalty shown to her, and she received the spectacle as proof that her reign still held the imagination of the people. For a woman who had once fled from public demands into widowhood, the sight of crowds calling her name after 60 years carried deep reassurance. Telegraphy gave the Diamond Jubilee a modern dimension. Messages of congratulation could move across imperial distances with a speed unknown at the beginning of Victoria's reign. The same monarchy that had begun with messengers arriving at Kensington now presided over an empire connected by cables, steamships, railways, and printed news. Communication did not make the empire equal or intimate, but it made it more administratively and emotionally imaginable. A loyal address could be sent from far away and received as part of one great imperial conversation. The old crown had entered an age of wires. The Jubilee celebrations also hid many tensions beneath their surface. Ireland remained unsettled. Class inequality persisted in industrial Britain. The empire faced resistance, criticism, and moral contradiction. The South African question was growing more dangerous. India, celebrated in imperial language, contained political currents that would later challenge British rule more openly. Even at the height of Jubilee display, Britain was not a peaceful family gathered around a grandmother. It was a powerful state with unresolved conflicts inside and beyond its borders. Ceremony did not remove those conflicts. It arranged them out of sight for a day. Yet ceremony has its own historical force. People remember what they gather to see, and states often survive through repeated acts of public imagination. The Jubilees allowed millions to think of Victoria's reign as continuous, providential, and shared. They turned age into legitimacy. They gave the monarchy a place within modern mass politics without making the Queen campaign, argue, or govern directly. They transformed a sovereign who had once risked becoming invisible into one of the most recognizable figures in the world. In that sense, the Jubilees were not decorative additions to the reign, they were part of its survival. For Victoria's family, the Jubilees were also gatherings of inheritance. Children, grandchildren, and relatives appeared around her, some already carrying the future tensions of Europe in their titles and ambitions. Edward, still waiting as Prince of Wales, stood closer to the crown than ever and yet still outside its possession. Vicky's German world, Alexandra's Danish connections, Russian relations, and other dynastic threads all lay near the old queen's chair. the family seemed to prove the reach of her life. It also hinted at a future that would not remain under her calm authority. The public image of the late queen was now fixed in its essential form. She was small, old, dressed in black, often severe in expression, and surrounded by signs of rank. Her face had become familiar through photographs and engravings, not as the face of youthful romance, but as the face of endurance. The empire attached itself to that face because it needed a human center. Parliamentary government could be abstract, cabinet politics tiresome, and imperial administration distant. Victoria gave the system a person whom ordinary loyalty could recognize. The girl from Kensington had become an image repeated across the world. After the Diamond Jubilee, the reign continued, but it had entered its final weather. Victoria still read papers, followed politics, cared about family, guarded Albert's memory, and judged ministers with the old sharpness. But the celebration of 60 years had given the country a sense that it was already looking at history while she still lived. She was no longer merely the reigning queen. She was the last living presence of an earlier 19th century, carried forward into the edge of a new one. The next and final chapter begins where so many parts of her life had gone for refuge, at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, where the long reign would finally come to rest. Chapter 16. Osborne and the end of a reign. Osborne House stood on the Isle of Wight with a meaning unlike the older royal residences of Victoria's life. Kensington had belonged to childhood and control. Buckingham Palace had belonged to office. Windsor had carried the weight of monarchy, memory, and mourning. Balmoral had given her the Highland world she loved after Albert's death. Osborne, though, had been shaped most closely by the marriage itself. Victoria and Albert had bought it, enlarged it, arranged it, and made it into a family home beside the sea, a place where royal life could seem less trapped inside the old ceremonial architecture of power. By the final years of Victoria's reign, Osborne had become a residence of age as much as memory. The queen who came there was no longer the young sovereign who had once delighted in independence after Kensington, nor the bride who had written of Albert with open rapture, nor the grieving widow whose withdrawal had alarmed ministers and critics. She was an old woman whose life had outlasted almost every early companion of her reign. The century had changed around her. Railways, telegraphs, illustrated newspapers, photography, mass politics, imperial wars, colonial government, and European nationalism had all grown during the long span of her rule. She had not made all of that world, but her name had become attached to it. Her daily life still carried work. Papers came to her, and she read them with the attention of a sovereign who had never surrendered her interest in public affairs. Ministers still had to consider her views, especially on empire, foreign policy, army matters, appointments, and the dignity of the crown. She could be old, tired, and physically limited, yet her opinions remained sharp. Lord Salisbury, who served as Prime Minister through much of her final period, dealt with a monarch formed by more than 6 decades of habit. Victoria might no longer appear often before crowds, but the monarchy still passed through her hand in documents, questions, objections, and approvals. The Boer War darkened the final years. Britain's conflict in South Africa, beginning in 1899, came to Victoria through reports of battles, reverses, casualties, sieges, public anxiety, and imperial determination. She followed the war closely and cared intensely about soldiers, as she had during earlier conflicts. The war also revealed that the empire celebrated in the Diamond Jubilee was not a settled family of loyal peoples, but a contested structure held together by force, policy, settlement, and ambition. Late in life, Victoria still saw herself as a sovereign whose duty included sympathy for those who fought under her name. The state around that sympathy was harder than the feeling itself. Family remained near the center of her attention. Edward, Prince of Wales, was approaching old age without having reigned. He had waited longer than most heirs, living for decades under a mother who loved him, criticized him, and rarely trusted him with the fullness of public responsibility he desired. His wife Alexandra stood beside him with grace that the public had long admired. Around them spread children, grandchildren, and European relations, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, whose presence near the end of her life carried the complicated future of Europe into the rooms of a dying queen. The family that seemed to gather Europe together also carried rivalries no family feeling could command. Victoria's health declined in the winter of 1900 and 1901. Age had already narrowed her strength, and the pressures of war, family losses, political concern, and physical weakness gathered around her final weeks. At Osborne, the household understood that the long reign was nearing its end, though such understanding often comes gradually before it becomes official fact. Doctors attended, relatives came, messages moved. The routines of monarchy, family, and illness settled into the same house where Albert's memory had lived for more than half a century. A reign that had begun with messengers arriving at Kensington now approached its close through watches kept in rooms by the sea. The presence of her family gave the end a dynastic shape. Edward was there, no longer only the son judged by his mother's standards, but the man who would inherit the throne the moment she died. Kaiser Wilhelm II also came, a grandson and an emperor representing the European family network that Victoria's marriages had helped create. Other relatives and attendants gathered according to rank, affection, duty, and access. The scene was private in feeling and constitutional in consequence. Around an old woman's bed stood the next reign, the German Empire, the British court, the memory of Albert, and the waiting machinery of the state. Victoria died on January 23, 1901. The fact was simple, but its meaning was enormous. She had reigned for more than 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. The girl born in 1819, guarded under the Kensington system, had lived through the transformation of Britain into an industrial and imperial power of extraordinary reach. Her death ended not only a reign, but a way of naming time. People who had spent their whole lives as Victorians suddenly belonged to a new reign before they had learned how to speak of it naturally. The constitution moved at once. Edward became king immediately, before proclamation, before coronation, before mourning had found its public form. That is one of monarchy's oldest practical truths. The sovereign dies, but the crown does not wait. Edward VII, long Prince of Wales, inherited not the young uncertainty that had faced Victoria in 1837, but an old institution heavily shaped by her image. He had to follow a mother who had become almost inseparable from the century itself. His accession opened the Edwardian age, but it began inside the shadow of Victoria's extraordinary duration. Public mourning spread quickly. News traveled through newspapers, telegraph lines, official notices, church bells, parliamentary statements, and conversations in ordinary streets. Britain had lost rulers before, but Victoria's death felt different because her reign had lasted beyond personal memory for so many of her subjects. To younger adults, she had always been there. To older people, she connected their present to a world of stagecoaches, early railways, old political arrangements, and the first years after the Napoleonic settlement. Her death made the 19th century feel, suddenly, like something that could be closed. The funeral arrangements joined her own wishes, military ceremony, family grief, and national display. Victoria had left instructions that she did not want a holy black funeral. White appeared in the ceremonies around her death, and military elements honored her long attachment to the army. Her body was carried from Osborne, then through the stages of royal ritual that returned her from the privacy of the island to the public mourning of the kingdom. The movement of the funeral repeated, in reverse, the long pattern of her reign: household, family, service, state, procession, burial. Objects accompanied her according to the private meanings she had chosen. Some related to Albert, some to John Brown, some to the intimate memory world she had guarded for decades. This was characteristic of Victoria. Public ceremony could surround her, but private attachment remained inside it. The Queen, who had made mourning a structure of life, did not leave the world without arranging memory near her body. In the last ceremonial acts, as in so much of the reign, the state and the household touched the same objects. Her burial at Frogmore placed her beside Albert in the mausoleum she had built for them. The physical closeness mattered because she had spent 40 years making his absence present. Since 1861, Albert had remained the central figure of her inner life. The husband, advisor, reformer, father, and idealized companion against whom later people were measured. To be laid beside him gave the long widowhood its final arrangement. The reign that had continued without him ended in the place prepared for reunion. Assessing Victoria is difficult because she became too large a symbol to be easily seen. She was not the sole author of the Victorian age. Parliament, industry, empire, capitalism, reform movements, workers, inventors, soldiers, colonized peoples, writers, scientists, ministers, and ordinary families all made that century's history. Yet she mattered because symbols matter and because she gave the age a human center. Her face, her widowhood, her family, her longevity, and her imperial title allowed millions to imagine a changing world through one continuous figure. She was neither powerless nor absolute. Her influence lay between those extremes, in the working space of constitutional monarchy. She warned, objected, encouraged, delayed, advised, preferred, disliked, remembered, and insisted. She could not keep Gladstone from office when politics required him. She could not make empire just by wishing to be a protective sovereign. She could not prevent her descendants from entering rival national futures, yet she could shape tone, ceremony, appointment, memory, and public feeling. The limits of her power did not make it unreal. Her private life also resists simplification. She was a guarded child, a passionate young woman, a devoted wife, an impatient mother, a demanding widow, a sharp political correspondent, an imperial sovereign, and an old grandmother whose family reached across Europe. She could be affectionate and severe, loyal and resentful, dutiful and self-absorbed, emotionally intense and institutionally disciplined. These contradictions do not weaken the story, they are the story. A reign of more than 6 decades could not have been carried by a single mood. The world after her death changed quickly, though not all at once. Edward VII brought a different tone to monarchy. More sociable, more worldly, more outwardly relaxed. The old queen's black dress and guarded seclusion gave way to a court that seemed brighter on the surface. Beneath that brightness, many of the tensions of Victoria's age remained. Empire still stretched widely, Ireland still troubled the Union, class politics grew sharper, Germany rose under her grandson. Within little more than a decade, Europe would enter a war that broke much of the dynastic world her family had appeared to bind together. Victoria did not live to see that rupture. Her own story ended with the empire still vast, the monarchy still secure, and the public image of her reign still powerful. The Diamond Jubilee had presented Britain as a global power gathered around an ancient queen. Her death only a few years later left that image suspended between triumph and fragility. Later history would know more than the mourners of 1901 could know. It would see the empire challenged, the old royal networks broken, and the certainties of Victorian Britain questioned from many directions. The Queen's life remained behind it all, not as explanation for everything, but as the long frame within which so much had happened. At Frogmore, the public scale of the reign narrowed again to stone, names, and the quiet arrangement of burial. The girl from Kensington, the bride of Albert, the widow of Windsor, the Empress of India, the grandmother of Europe, and the old Queen of Jubilee Britain came to rest in one place. Around her memory gathered palaces, letters, portraits, laws, processions, railway stations, colonial offices, family albums, medals, mourning clothes, and the endless printed references of an age that had taken her name. History scattered those traces widely, but the body of the Queen lay beside the husband whose absence had shaped half her life. Beyond the mausoleum, the reign passed into record. Edward's ministers took up their papers, courtiers adjusted titles and forms of address. Newspapers used new language, coins and official documents would change in due time. People who had spoken of the Queen all their lives learned to speak of the King. Nothing stopped because monarchy had long ago learned how to make death into continuity, yet something immense had altered. A living presence had become memory, and a century that had seemed to stand under one woman's gaze moved on without her. The stone at Frogmore remained, and the names remained with it. Winter air moved over the grounds, over paths and grass, and the walls that held the royal dead. The old ceremonies ended, the crowds dispersed, the black-edged papers were folded away, and the long reign settled into the stillness of things left behind. A crown passed on, a house emptied, a name carved into history, and beside it the enduring quiet of Albert's name in the same place. The journey is complete. Rest well.